Thank you, Jana, and you, Jorijn, for opening this special event this Friday afternoon. And thank you all for joining us today at the end of the project, but at the start of something much bigger. When Workshop Intangible Heritage and her partners started this project about 2 years ago, we could have only dreamt to be able to share such an incredible journey and such inspiring cases and methods as we can today. Of course, this project does not stand alone. As Jorijn explained, the project is an accumulation of all the hard work that has been accomplished in the past, both by our organization, but also certainly by the museums and the partners involved. We couldn't have done it without you. The project Plans for the Future, ICH Included in Museums, is a Flemish project on integrating living heritage in museums, collection planning and management. It spotlights one of the facets explored in the European ICH and Museums project, and is the next step in a line of research about the safeguarding of ICH and the involvement of museums in this process, which was officially initiated in 2017 by the Flemish government with the Cultural Heritage Decree. Now, this decree meant a policy renewal for many organizations working with cultural heritage, as it puts an integrated approach first. It's not self-evident, of course, because of the different logics behind the care and heritage care for tangible and intangible cultural heritage, which is in turn related to the way that museums care for material collections. And although many museums have been working with ICH communities, we want to work with these ICH communities. The manifestation of this type of work is often easier said than done. There were and are still a lot of questions, a lot of practical questions as to how one sets about integrating ICH in the museum collection plans and policy. It's here that the project ICH Included finds its starting point. We wanted to take a new and joint step in this complex and multifaceted challenge and focus on the questions coming directly from museums themselves. Of course, we had to start somewhere, and this meant research and outreaching. The first phase of the project started with an opening conference in Tilburg in the Netherlands, which we organized together with the Dutch Center for Intangible Cultural Heritage, or KIM. The conference held a variety of speakers, from museum professionals to ICH practitioners. And afterwards, we held parallel work sessions, each with its own theme. We were off to a great start, although it became apparent that not all museums were on the same track. And with that, we mean some were asking deeper and more practical questions, whereas others still were questioning what is ICH and if it would be possible for them to start thinking about integrating it into their policy. This was something we noticed very early on and in every phase of the project. But rather than to see it as a challenge, we took it as a strength and used it to connect museums. One could learn about practical matters and the other could offer a fresh and new perspective on a matter. We also surveyed a dozen of Flemish museums to identify exactly which are the thresholds and difficulties and to find out what answers are possible. To widen our scope and put Flemish situation in a broader context, we also repeated this questionnaire with several other European museums that are within the IMP network. And for this, I want to thank our amazing intern, Marjan. This benchmark study showed that the question posed by the Flemish museums were also posed everywhere else in Europe. Big difference between the studies, of course, were the national regional policies, whether or not the government included ICH in their framework. And more information about this study will, of course, be featured in our report. So we now know what issues or challenges Flemish museums were working with. And the next step was to find museums to analyze and discuss these matters and put some ideas into practice. The Museum van Busleyden and the Jenevermuseum, which will be presented to you shortly, joined our project at the very beginning to act as living lab museums. And they would serve as testing grounds where we would try to solve or answer some of the practical matters. We were thrilled, but also we were wondering how we could involve even more museums. And because the only way for this project to be as representative as possible to the entire cultural heritage field in Flanders and beyond, we needed more museums. and more types of museums, more voices to question, discuss, and also inspire us. So we decided to launch 2 open calls, one for an additional Living Lab museum, and one for the museums who were willing to participate in the project and to act as a learning network. Well, the results speak for themselves. Not only did we receive 20 registrations for the Living Network, but we also welcomed not 1, but 2 new Living Lab museums. In total, 25 Flemish, national and regional museums of all sorts and sizes joined the project to explore their own and other museums' possibilities to integrate ICH. So this is great news. It promised to be an interesting year, full of museum visits, full of dialogue and establishing new collections, new connections rather, or presenting interesting current ones. But as we all are well aware and are experiencing at this very moment, these visits never came to fruition. And the COVID-19 pandemic shut down all cultural events and organizations for a lengthy period of time here in Flanders. So then the question came, how are we going to organize these living labs? Is it possible to conduct such an intense project online through videos and Zoom meetings? Well, we can most certainly say yes, it was possible, but still the online meetings, they kind of offered a way for us, museums from all over Flanders, from one end to the country to the other, regional to the other, to meet each other. The project itself was structured as we can see here. There were common sessions such as the kickoff event for the Learning Network in January 2020, and the intervisions in which all museums could connect with each other throughout the project. And at the start of the second phase, at the kickoff event, participating museums could choose 1 or more Living Lab museums to follow and explore in their trajectory. The Living Lab museums as well could also take part in each other's experiments. Each Living Lab museum had its own trajectory, starting with a virtual visitation to the museum and its collections. They would go on hosting several workshops related to the questions and challenges present. And complementary to the workshops and interventions, we also launched the test case digital registration in ICH, transforming living heritage into data. With this initiative, we delved deeper into the practical and theoretical questions about registering living heritage with different aspects of into a digital database and linking it to a material collection. But more of this later this afternoon, and Bert from Meemoo will explain more about it. So this project, it proved to be quite a large but a very successful undertaking. We discussed, we agreed, and we also disagreed. We explored multiple situations and options on how to grasp ICH in a museum setting and in collection policy plans. There are so many questions, but we feel that we have a firm footing and established a network that we will hope will only continue to grow and to share. And we hope that this conference will inspire you and many other museums as organizations to take a look inside, to reach out into your own environment. And again, a special thanks to all the partners and museums involved. Thank you.
We zijn hier in het Jenevermuseum in Hasselt en volgend jaar vieren wij onze 40ste verjaardag. En als we daar eventjes op terugblikken op al die jaren, dan kunnen we toch wel vaststellen dat wij al 40 jaar, meestal weliswaar onbewust, bezig zijn met dat immateriële Belgische Jenever-erfgoed. Want 40 jaar geleden, toen het museum werd opgericht, wilden de oprichters, de toenmalige oprichters, er een levend, dynamisch museum van maken. En levend of dynamisch dan in de zin van, we moeten aan de mensen kunnen tonen hoe dat er Belgische Jenever gemaakt werd. En dat doen we dus al bijna 40 jaar. De stokerij was iets later operationeel. Maar we doen dat dus door te werken in een beschermde, volledig gerestaureerde 19e eeuwse stokerij die volledig op stoom werkt. We hebben een stoker in dienst, een meester-stoker in dienst, die al die aspecten van dat stookproces in de vingers heeft of moet krijgen. Dat is één belangrijk aspect van het immateriële Genever-erfgoed. Dus die technieken, die vaardigheden om dat productieproces in de vingers te krijgen en om dus Genever te gaan maken op traditionele manier. Een tweede belangrijk aspect zijn de tradities die erbij komen kijken. Vooral wanneer we Genever gaan drinken, het consumptiegedrag van u, van mij, van onze voorouders. Wat dronken zij, welke Genevers dronken zij precies, hoe dronken zij die, bij welke gelegenheden. Dat is een tweede belangrijk aspect van die immateriële erfgoedwerking die wij hier in het museum proberen na te streven. En de laatste jaren zijn we daar toch wel op een iets wat bewustere manier mee omgegaan. En om die reden zijn we ook ingestapt in het project van de werkplaats immaterieel erfgoed. Allereerst hebben we natuurlijk een aantal doelstellingen geformuleerd die wij als museum binnen dit project wilden bereiken. In eerste instantie was dat hoe moeten wij onze immaterieel erfgoedpraktijken die met Genever te maken hebben gaan registreren. Gebeurt dat op dezelfde manier als onze roerende collecties? Of moeten we een andere methodiek hanteren? Moeten we andere criteria hanteren? En een tweede belangrijke doelstelling voor ons binnen dit project is dan hoe gaan wij onze immateriële erfgoedwerking integreren in onze visie op onze collectie, in ons collectiebeleid. En als we daarvan geraken, dan hebben we een mooi project of een mooi traject afgelegd. Het Jenevermuseum stapte dan als proeftuin samen met 3 andere musea in het project van de werkplaats. En samen met het lerend netwerk dat de werkplaats tot leven heeft gewekt, hebben wij een aantal issues die wij hier in onze immateriële erfgoedwerking hebben op tafel gesmeten en samen met de collega's uit het museumveld, uit het erfgoedveld besproken. We hebben heel interessante suggesties gekregen, tips om daarmee om te gaan. We hebben zelf natuurlijk ook onze eigen ervaring gedeeld, hoe wij daar tot nog toe mee omgingen. En ja, dat leidde toch wel tot een goede visie op hoe wij er in de toekomst mee zouden willen omgaan. En kort samengevat komt het erop neer dat wij echt wel gaan voor een geïntegreerde en integrale benadering van het immaterieel erfgoed, immaterieel Genever erfgoed, waarbij we dat erfgoed op gelijke voet gaan behandelen als de roerende collecties, als de manier waarop we met onze roerende collecties omgaan. Kortom, voor ons was het, zoals we in onze baseline zeggen, eentje om bij te leren. Maar nu is het misschien tijd voor nog eentje om het af te leren.
We zijn in dit traject gestapt omdat we op zoek waren naar de manier om op een heel goede manier te gaan samenwerken tussen de erfgoedcel en het museum rond immaterieel cultureel erfgoed. Maar anderzijds ook om te zoeken naar een manier hoe je het grote veld van immaterieel cultureel erfgoed kunt afbakenen. We hebben de casus van de reuzendragers gekozen, omdat je daarin heel gemakkelijk kunt kijken van welke verschillende partners hier mee moeten aan tafel zitten. En dat is enerzijds de erfgoedcel, die daar op een bepaalde manier mee omgaat. Anderzijds de mensen van collectie, van het museum. En natuurlijk de gemeenschap zelf, de reuzendragers, die mee aan tafel zitten en allemaal hun perspectief geven over de mogelijkheid om dit element in een collectieplan in te brengen.
De reuzendragers zijn een vrijwilligersgroep, ontstaan eigenlijk op de historische omgang in Mechelen in 2013. We zagen daar dat de kennisdeling, de kennis-know-how rond het reuzendragen, rond die traditie, die toch al 500 jaar, meer dan 500 jaar meegaat in Mechelen, dat die eigenlijk zeer beperkt was, of voor ons toch zeer beperkt leek. En dat er ook geen kennisoverdracht leek te zijn in die 25 jaar tussen die verschillende edities van de omgangen. Vandaar dat we ons met een aantal mensen hebben verzameld, dat we naar het museum zijn gekomen en dat we eigenlijk gevraagd hebben om een kader te scheppen, om die kennisoverdracht in de eerste plaats, om die te garanderen. En anderzijds ook te gaan nadenken over de omgang met die reuzen, zowel als immaterieel erfgoed, maar ook als collectiestukken.
Een traditioneel collectieplan vertrekt doorgaans vanuit het object. Dus dat wordt beschreven naar materiaaltechnische eigenschappen toe. En van daaruit is dat eigenlijk een beetje een lineair perspectief, waarbij dat op basis daarvan wordt bepaald hoe dat er verder met het object en met de museale collectie wordt omgegaan. Als het over immaterieel cultureel erfgoed gaat, moeten we eigenlijk anders denken. Het gaat niet enkel over een object. Er zijn doorgaans wel objecten mee verbonden, maar ook de traditie op zichzelf of de ambacht en vooral ook de mensen die daar onlosmakelijk mee verbonden zijn. En die mensen zijn verbonden met het object en met de traditie. De traditie is verbonden met het object en met de mensen en het object zelf ook weer met de traditie en de mensen. Dus dat is een cirkeltje en het is heel belangrijk dat er vanuit collectiebeheer echt bij stilgestaan wordt en dat mensen daar ook een open blik op hebben.
Vanuit erfgoedcel merken we vooral op dat het heel belangrijk is om duidelijke richtlijnen te stellen. Enerzijds vanuit het museum, dat er duidelijk gemaakt wordt wat is belangrijk voor een museum, hoe moet er omgegaan worden met die stukken. Maar die moeten ook heel goed op voorhand worden afgetoetst met de erfgoedgemeenschap van wat is praktisch haalbaar.
Onze vraag naar het museum toe is vooral voor ons een kader te scheppen. Het is onze bedoeling, of het is ergens onze droom zal ik maar zeggen, om die traditie, om die levendig te houden. Maar dan is het wel belangrijk dat we vanuit het museum een aantal krijtlijnen krijgen. Bijvoorbeeld naar bewaring toe, naar transport toe van die reuzen als collectiestukken dan. En dat we weten hoe ver dat we kunnen gaan en hoe we kunnen werken, hoe we kunnen omgaan met die reuzen. Aan de ene kant die traditie in ere kunnen houden, maar anderzijds er ook kunnen mee voor zorgen dat die collectiestukken ook op een goede manier bewaard blijven.
Voor het collectieplan van het museum gaat het heel belangrijk zijn om de gemeenschap, in dit geval dan de reuzendragersgemeenschap, erbij te betrekken. Waar zij heel erg nood aan hebben is een duidelijk kader, richtlijnen die vanuit het museum gesteld worden om te bepalen van in hoeverre kunnen we met deze objecten omgaan. Het museum kan deze richtlijnen opstellen, maar het is ook belangrijk dat dit geen eenrichtingsverkeer wordt, maar dat dat ook opnieuw in samenspraak met de gemeenschap gebeurt. Die richtlijnen die kunnen dan ook een basis vormen om mee opgenomen te worden in het collectiebeleidsplan.
Als we kijken naar die verschillende perspectieven, dan denk ik dat de dialoog die eruit ontstaan is en die je ziet ontstaan in dit proces misschien wel het belangrijkste is wat we hieruit kunnen leren. Dat een collectiebeleidsplan niet eenzijdig wordt geschreven, maar dat je de gemeenschappen en ook bijvoorbeeld een erfgoedcel meeneemt in zo'n proces.
Tal Bisschop asks, for both museums, what was the most surprising insight that you learned or that you had during the whole project? Okay, and then a special question, especially for Hof van Busleyden, from Tate de Ridder. How does the practice get further translated in the museum, besides showing the objects, the giants? So this is a real specific question, how you can translate and show the intangible practice besides showing just the objects. Maybe we can start with that question for you, Sigrid.
Yes, in the museum you don't you see the giant, but you also we made the scenography together with the people, the giant carriers. And so we made a film with them, which we show in the museum, and which also helps them to promote themselves. And in the interaction with the heritage unit, we work with them and other intangible heritage elements. For instance, the Sintemette singers. And we work with them, and so we keep the heritage of the giant carrying alive. So we do more than just presenting it, but we try to work with them also in the presentation.
Okay. We continue for a bit on this subject because there's another question about the giants. Has the project with the giants had any financial consequence concerning assurance fees? Wow, okay. Sigrid, you nod. You know how to answer this.
This is very specific, and I think a lot of the questions about how far can we go in taking the giants out and carrying them through the streets are about these questions about insurance and things like that, and how much it costs to take the giants to another place and things like that. So of course, the museum takes the assurance for the giants for this moment, but we are talking with a community in how can we create like a VZW, I don't know what it is in English, and find ways to share also this responsibility.
Okay. Thank you for answering this more technical but interesting question. Let's circle back to the question we received earlier from Chantal, both for you and Davy. Chantal was wondering what is the most surprising insight that you gained during the project. Davy, maybe, or
well, to me, the most
yeah.
the most surprising thing of insight was that. Museums like our museum with technical collections, industrial technical collections, working with ICH was kind of unexplored territory. So it was very nice to exchange approaches, methods we already used to approach ICH. And the most important insight is there is not one definite approach. There are many approaches, and it's to everyone, to itself, to explore those methods and to find out what works the best for their collections. So maybe that's one of the most
main
interesting
insights.
things we learned.
Thank you, Davy. Sigrid?
I think one really concrete example of what we learned when we made this film, I learned, and I didn't know, that there was more knowledge about how to work with the giants, with the community, than there was with a museum. So how do you take care of them when you transport them and things like that? The community gave information to the museum, so it was a bit the world turned around. And I think what was most interesting for me in the whole projectory was the diversity of possibilities in working with intangible cultural heritage, and the diversity of possibilities in going about trying to get it into a collection plan or how you work. It's very dependent on what kind of museum you are, and that makes it very rich. And that's what's nice about working together and talking with colleagues.
All the more interesting, the more diverse it got. Thank you so much for sharing these insights. I have not received any more questions. We would just like to ask that when you're not speaking or listen, please mute your audio, because sometimes there's a little interference of, I don't know, messages coming in somewhere. Thank you. Since we haven't received any more questions, I suggest we go watch another very diverse, another different museum, which is also a proof of what we've just discussed about how every museum is different and everybody has this different approach, which makes the projects all the more richer. So we're going to watch the video of the Huis van Alijn, which is a museum in Gent.
We zijn hier in het Huis van Alijn. Het Huis van Alijn is het museum van het dagelijks leven. Wij focussen op rituelen, tradities, gewoontes van het dagelijks leven, van de levensfasen, van de jaarkalender. En we verzamelen onze collectie vanaf de 20e eeuw tot vandaag. Afgelopen jaar bood ons de kans om heel intens met ICE bezig te zijn. Wat betekent ICE voor het Huis van Alijn? Om dat echt te gaan uitwerken in ons collectieplan. Maar het was fascinerend om te zien, net het moment dat je met de immateriële facet bezig bent, dat het belang van de materiële en digitale collecties net ook weer naar boven in het vizier komt. Want het ene kan in het Huis van Alijn zonder het andere. Als Huis van Alijn gaan wij ICE niet gaan verzamelen, maar documenteren wij ICE. En dat doen we met onze collectie, met onze objecten, documenten, films, foto's, digitaal of fysiek. Dus net dat zijn de dragers van de vele ICE-borgingsmaatregelen eigenlijk. Maar je moet ze natuurlijk linken met elkaar. Een object aan zich is geen ICE. Een verhaal op zich is geen ICE. Maar als je ze koppelt, ensembles maakt en dat er nog in een tijdspanne vanaf het begin 20e eeuw tot vandaag doortrekt, dan heb je echt wel de veranderingen van het dagelijks leven. De veranderingen in tradities, gewoontes, rituelen. En daar draait het om bij ICE. En je kunt daar natuurlijk nog vele stappen verder in gaan. En als je als museum dit vastpakt, wat dat het proeftuintraject ons echt wel mooi getoond heeft, dan ga je echt wel voor een resoluut museum waar dat ICE centraal stelt. Het is ook belangrijk om ICE mee te nemen in de registratie. In het Huis van Alijn deden we dat met een bepaalde naturella, omdat het hoort bij het huis. De dagelijkse dingen worden automatisch door de schenker erbij verteld. En heel vaak gaan wij daar al mee aan de slag bij registratie. Maar nu moet je dat echt op een gestructureerde niveau gaan doen. En als je dit doet, dan kun je daar echt heel veel mee doen. En kun je echt ook die verhalen, die daar veel mee gaan doen in presentaties, in publiekswerking. En als je dat natuurlijk voor een jarenlang collectiebeleid doet, dan heb je echt ICE-borgingsmaatregelen waar je ook ICE naar het publiek mee kan delen, zonder daarom echt te focussen op het theoretische verhaal van ICE, maar gewoon de essentie van, wat is die collectiebeleid van het huis? En dat gaat veel meer over de betekenis van het collectiestuk dan het collectiestuk aan zich. En als je dat durft vastpakken als museum, dan kom je een heel eind. En dan overstijg je ook echt de pure focus op de dingen die je verzamelt. Sommige erfgoedgemeenschappen gelinkt aan ICE zijn heel duidelijk. Maar dat is niet voor alle rituele tradities, gewoontes zo. Zeker de thema's waar het Huis van Alijn rond werkt. Soms wel, bijvoorbeeld een optocht of een stoet is een duidelijk wel omlijnde erfgoedgemeenschap die betrokken is. Maar bij andere, bijvoorbeeld geboorterituelen of het vieren van je verjaardag, dat is een vage erfgoedgemeenschap. Eigenlijk maakt iedereen daar deel van uit. Hoe gaan we daar als Huis van Alijn mee aan de slag? Dat is ook wel even zoeken. We hebben een traditie om via oproepen collectiemateriaal te verzamelen. En eigenlijk zijn we dan ook aan het sensibiliseren rond wat is ICE, wat is erfgoed algemeen, maar zeker wat is ICE. En de focus die we hadden afgelopen jaar, dat mee die collectie mee in het vizier kwam, dat je net het ICE gaat documenteren door het in beeld te brengen via objecten, foto's, film, heeft ons versterkt dat die participatie van het publiek echt wel nodig is. Dus we gaan daar de komende tijd nog wat meer op inzetten, op het verzamelen van foto's, film, objecten met het publiek, om zo dat ICE dat eigenlijk in onze intieme familiesfeer afspeelt, te gaan verzamelen en te gaan in beeld brengen. Dus daar gaan we extra op inzetten, samen met het publiek, om net die verandering centraal te stellen. Het dagelijks leven verandert, die tradities, rituelen veranderen en ICE, dat gaat eigenlijk om beweging en verandering.
So this was all about the fact that intangible heritage is living heritage. Due to mutations and has to transform and live, which is beautifully documented in the Huis van Alijn. Thank you, Huis van Alijn and Els Veraverbeke. Els is here with us, and I think she's ready to answer questions, if there are any questions. Let's just give people a second. Jorijn, do you have a question? Because you raised your hand.
Yes, maybe, but of course...
Yes, please do, please do.
If there's others, we are very open because we had a lot of occasions already to ask them. But let me ask it in name of the group, because I think many people are curious. In the Huis van Alijn, you were already working on integrating ICH in your collection planning. How this is made concrete. Maybe you can talk a little more about that for the many museum colleagues that are present today.
Thank you, Jorijn. An interesting question. The last session we had with the small group was all about our collection planning and how to deal with eyes in our collection planning. We had, thanks to the Living Lab project, we had the chance to, sometimes you need an issue to have a great discussion inside of your museum with the staff. And the Living Lab Museum really was our issue to have these discussions. And we were discussing, we have material collections, we have digital collections, and do we have immaterial collection? Do we have them? It was really a question in our staff meetings. And the decision we made it as group was from, we have in collection our digital and material collections, but we do have immaterial collections, but not as such as a collection group. It is another kind of type of a collection, actually. And this was I was saying in the video. The focus on the immaterial, on the intangible of the heritage of daily life, brought the digital and the material collections in our view, because we always, before we were discussing it like it was something next to it, but then we realized no. The digital and the material collections are the carriers of the significance, actually. And therefore, in our collection policy, we will describe the classical issues about collecting material and digital collections. What do we collect? How do we collect them? And so on. Of course, the specific point of view of the House of Alijn is the collaboration with the public, the participatory way of thinking in collection management. And next to it, we will have a part of our collection policy about ICH, which is linking to the material and digital collections. So we will really describe it, but we will describe it at the end of this year. Normally, it would have been published already earlier, as I said at the beginning of the Living Lab project. But due to last year's issues, I will call them, we have prolonged it till the end of this year. But we will take it like this. We will have a part that really is going on the material and digital collection management, and next to it, a part of the ICH collections, which is of course linked to the collections we are really collecting, but the immaterial, the intangible collections are more a way of dealing with them. That's how we describe it now. I hope this is an answer to.
I think it is. We received another question in the chat, but first I would like to give the floor to Sophie Elpers, who raised her hand. Sophie, please go ahead.
Hello, everybody. Hello, Els. You mentioned the dynamics of intangible cultural heritage. So I was curious, did you already find a way how to deal with this dynamic character of intangible cultural heritage in your collection management?
Thank you, Sophie. An interesting question. And the museum itself, it has a long history. We are collecting already for 100 years. And we see the collection management change from collecting a small part, a small Ghent, and only the beginning of the 20th century. But now in our collection policy, we really start collection from the 20th century on till today. So you already focused on the dynamics. But the dynamics in recent period are, of course, they're huge. And that was one of the main questions we brought into this Living Lab project. How do you collect the diversity of rituals, traditions in our society? And how do you collect them for nowadays, the contemporary collecting? And of course, it has so many issues about the rights you can use the collections. Also for the audience, there has to be some time before people sometimes realize it's a kind of heritage. So, for instance, today's activities, people don't bring them to the collection in a film or photo of an object because there is no awareness that it is already heritage, or it could be heritage. So you have to activate itself as a museum. And that was really something we were dealing with. And for instance, for the how to collect diverse heritage, we had already some some projects going on in which we thought it will bring the diversity and the contemporary in our collection, but it didn't quite work very, very well. And now we will start, now we realize our participatory way of collecting was always with a very huge communication. So we thought we can reach everybody, but now we learned we have to really activate some specific groups. You have to connect with specific groups if you want to collect them in your, if you want to have them in your museum and in your collection management. But of course, how do you select in this huge mass of diverse rituals, traditions? That is a really research project in our specific for the for collections about daily life. This is so huge. This is really something every museum of daily life worldwide is dealing with. So this is, you have to collect the, you have to focus on the ICH facets of the heritage, but also to the typical humanity facets. How do you connect with people? How do you connect with specific groups? How do you select in which tradition you will collect or not? And an important issue for us is that there we can activate some things as a museum, but the initiative has to come from the public. And now we are focusing on who has a connection with our call for action, actually. So this is our first step, but there will be many more steps along, I think.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Sophie, for the question. So it's a continuum of asking yourselves those questions as a museum staff as well. A similar question actually reached us in the chat from Jonas Raats, who was triggered by the fact that you said those communities aren't that well defined. Those heritage communities involved with the ICH of the Huis van Alijn aren't that well defined. So how do you reach them? You already answered this partly in your answer to Sophie. How do you reach communities that are not so connected with the museums? Is it about, like you said, the question has to be raised and come from them, and then the museum can switch into action, or are you actively also scouting and looking for them?
Actually, we do both. We are acting ourselves and try to activate others, communities, people, specific groups and so on. But we have also an open door for questions from people who wants to connect with the Huis of Alijn, specific about a traditional ritual. In the Living Lab project, we had a testimony of somebody who we worked with about the Nowruz project. Nowruz is a kind of New Year's tradition, but from people from Persia, from Afghanistan, and so on. And in Ghent, a few people were dealing with, we celebrate our Nowruz party, and how can we connect that people living in Belgium know what we are doing, and the diverse, the vice versa. And in this, the people who are working with, who we worked with, had a testimony in this Living Lab project about how they thought the Huis of Alijn could be an ideal partner for them. So, because it's in the Huis of Alijn, we have our narrative of the exhibitions is the calendar of the year. So it was a natural way of dealing with, we can bring in this Nowruz festivities into the New Year's room. And so people who are celebrating Nowruz can see their festivity recognized as heritage, but also who doesn't know Nowruz can discover this festivity as a festivity, but also as heritage, part of that takes place in Belgium.
And as part of the calendar.
And it's part of the calendar, of course.
It's a great way of approaching it. Any other questions? There's Jorijn put the link of the Nowruz project in the chat. Thank you, Jorijn. I haven't received any more questions, and I don't see any raised hands. So, Shana. Okay, Shana, please go ahead.
Yes, I have a question for the Jenevermuseum. We're talking about ICH communities, and within the project, the Jenevermuseum has also not been struggling, but questioning who is the community around the Geneva traditions, and if the museum itself is part of the ICH community, yes or no. And I was wondering if you could elaborate on that, Davy.
Yeah, yes, indeed. It was a very difficult question to answer. We have been brainstorming about that because especially when we're talking about traditional techniques, very few people are mastering those techniques. For instance, as we are doing in our museum, distilling using steam-driven, a steam-driven distillery. There's just only one other distillery in Belgium who's working with an old steam engine. So in short, there are only two people who can manage those techniques. So who is the community? Is the community existing of those two persons, or is the community existing of the people who are interested in those steaming principles? Or is a community existing of the our visitors who are watching the demonstration of our master distiller using those techniques? We're not sure. By now we are not sure of it. Who is exactly the community for that specific practice? So I think there are many possibilities to approach that question, and it depends on the practice. It depends on the way we as a museum approach it ourselves. So yeah, it's still an unanswered question by now, I think. Otherwise, there are, of course, when we're talking about Geneva, the traditions of drinking, consuming Geneva. Well, there's the community. There's also the question, how do you limit the community? Because everyone in Flanders, in Belgium, every once in a while drinks this alcoholic drink. So is every consumer part of the community? Or are they aware that they're part of a community if we define the community as all the consumers of Geneva as our heritage community? And now I say heritage community, or is it just a drinking community? So it's very difficult to answer these questions, and we are open to everybody who has sympathy for our national drink and its traditions. So I think everyone with a little bit of sympathy for the drink and the whole story behind the drink can be part of this heritage community.
Thank you, Davy. I see Dimfy.
Yes, I have a question for Els. First of all, I really recognize all the discussions you are sharing. I work in Museum Catharijnenconvent in Utrecht. We are a museum of Christian art and heritage, and we collect personal stories around the heritage. And my question is, we have a lot of discussion intern about collecting democratically. We have a website, people can share their stories, and the discussion is about, should you collection all the stories, or should we as a museum select certain stories? The discussion is, of course, who are we to decide which story is better than another story? Could you tell something about how the discussion on this is in your museum?
I recognize totally the question. Yes, because we have we collect many things with calls for action, as we say, and then there's always a discussion: when is something, which criteria you handle to decide it is an answer on a call for action, and we describe it as heritage.
When we have a call for action and every reaction, of course, when the reaction has a link with the call, of course, we always put something in our collection from everybody. But some people have brings in, but this is about materials. This is not about stories. This is not about telling with a story they tell. For instance, somebody is coming with a family album with pictures. When they are really interesting, we'll put in many pictures about it in our collection. But when it's not that interesting, we will put one, but there will be always one. But there's always a second phase when we have them put it in our collection. Then we decide which stories are really worth going deeper with it. And then we decide at this person's, we will have an interview with them, and we will add also this interview to our collection. So you have a first stage, and then you have many stages coming up, following up, and you go always deeper, and you have much more information. So when, but our point of vision is when people react on our call for action, and it's a huge effort, actually, you ask as a museum, for the public, for the audience. So we always do the minimalistic, that's guaranteed. Of course, when there's a link with the content of the question. And then we go always deeper with the stories that are really interesting. Then we have much more content in our collection base.
I think this answered your question, Davy.
Yes, and we do a similar way of, but it's
we do have a similar way because we are following also the Training Convent inspires us also.
Please keep that dialogue going on between the two of you, the two museums. Thank you so much. There's another question in the chat. Posted by our Shana, who's really awake today, because she says this also relates to the van Busleyden, what to do with slumbering ICH. Shana, can you elaborate a bit on the slumbering part, please, for everyone?
Yes, I can. Within one of the workshops, a team member of the Hof van Busleyden gave a presentation about the assigning significance to a certain part of the collection that was, a collection part of Hof van Busleyden. And the thing about it was that it's a really common object. It's a cane seating for a chair, but it has been done by a craftsman. And one of the team members said, we still keep it in a collection because it relates to an ICH tradition, but we're not sure if there's still a living heritage community, an intangible heritage community today. But because we're not sure, we're not willing to dispose of it. So I was wondering how, because it relates to the question for Els, like how do you decide? When will you decide that the objects that you have in your collection that might be related to ICH, when can you decide from we're not going to keep them anymore, or when do you decide we do keep them, even though when there's doubt?
And who do you want Sigrid to answer the question?
Sigrid or Elke, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Sigrid or Mareke.
Okay. I think Sigrid is there. Yeah.
A lot of possibilities. But I think I will rephrase the question, because for me, it's not about just collecting it because there's a connection with ICH. That's not the difficult part. The difficult part is relating to it and working with it. And I think that's a difficult part for Museum Hof van Busleyden, is when do you decide to actively work with your community? Because it's not, it's an easy thing to do, to say, okay, we will keep it in the collection because it's related to, but then you're not working with it. So what's the meaning of the object if you're not working with it? I think that's the question that lies behind it, and that's necessary to be tackled. But I don't have a solution yet, but just more questions.
That's why we have the learning network. Shana, is this an answer, a satisfying answer to your question? Okay. Any more questions?
I think maybe Marijke is will still has still another idea about it. So maybe.
Okay, please go ahead. Go ahead.
Hi. I haven't a clue whether I'm visible or not now.
You are.
Okay. Yeah. Hi. No, we were just wondering, that's why we thought the connection with the heritage cell is so important for working the bridge building and intermediate factor, where the heritage cell acts as an intermediate with the communities and has an active knowledge of which communities are working with certain types of intangible heritage. That's where this sort of coexistence, heritage unit and museums is really important to us.
Thanks, Marijke, for adding this. We have received a question in the chat from the International Forest Therapy Days. This person wants to ask a question from the ICH community side. Please, we would love to hear those questions. Your question would be how, as a community, you start to approach a museum. So this is a question also you want to direct towards the ICH communities here. First, I should say this is a professional network, so I'm not really sure how many of communities not involved in heritage cells or museum staff are here. I cannot see everyone, but there might be someone who would love to answer this question. If there is, please shout.
Maybe I can make it more precise. So,
okay, please do. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm Vitalia.
Hi.
Hi, I'm Vitalia, and yeah, I have like double hat. I must say, yeah, I'm representing Museum of Medicinal Plants and Pharmacy, which is University Museum.
Okay.
And we started to do work to transform museum into participatory museum, which, yeah, became very soon clear that it's extremely resource demanding work, and University Museum was not able to maintain and sustain this work. So this ambition was stopped, and then we continued and as community of practice, because I'm also not only museum worker, but as a practitioner of living tradition of using, cultivating and transforming medicinal plants into traditional medicines. So once the museum didn't have resources, we continued to work as community, how we can record our stories and how we can share knowledge and how can we support each other. And in the way we ended up, yeah, in this situation that our community still remains informal, so it's not on the heritage list, not in the inventory. Mm-hmm. And we also lost initial contacts with museum. So it's somehow, yeah, it was experimental, it was interesting, but for some people it was very disappointing. And the question from community side that often is addressed comes back to me as museum worker, how we can still continue to work and maybe to make efforts to contact more resourceful and stronger museums. So how I feel from my experience that it's always a bit risk calling communities and not being able to provide this support that they need. I don't know if someone has experience on that, and if someone is struggling with this situation, I would be really interested to hear your experiences and how to deal with these tensions, how to move forward, basically. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this question. I think it's a passionate concern of you, and I thank you for sharing it. I don't know if there's any of the Living Lab museums or anyone else who would love to elaborate on this.
Sergio wants to react.
Yes, I'm looking for. Okay, please do.
Yes, hello. I am talking now as a museum director, and I think this touches a bit of a fundamental problem with working with ICH and museums, which is that if you really go to the strict definition of ICH, where it has to be with living communities who are already busy with a tradition, or something that you want to implement that has links with your heritage or the place where you are. We, for instance, have at the Drogenbos, we have a specific problem where the only really strictly ICH thing is with archers community, heritage archers, and it's very difficult to involve them in our work, where we provide all the possibilities, because there is a language problem between different kind of publics who surround the museum. And so on the other hand, we can implement and recreate ICH kind of practices around us, but actually the one who is most important does become a problematic thing. So it's not coming, the call, it's not coming from them. So I think that there can also be problems in the other way, where you can provide everything, you can resolve, but they are not waiting for it. So this is, I think, a problem of an institutional obstacle. You become an obstacle being an institution. So I think that this could be a thematic that should be addressed a bit more. I don't know if it answers you, but I just wanted to add to your comment.
Thank you, Sergio. Yes, maybe not really a clear answer as how to act now, but a really important concern when working in a museum and working with these communities. Thank you very much. I think it's also something we take into account when thinking about the future of ICH also in policies regarding heritage and museums. So we'll keep it on the agenda. Vitaly, yeah, I think it wasn't, we don't have time to really dive so deep into your question, but it's a really important one. So I think we have some more discussion moments during today, and maybe some people will react on your question later on, or please feel free to add other things. We also received a question, just a second, of Ariane Fracour. Did the Learning Network conceive a standard procedure and technical means to record testimonies? It wasn't really part of this project, but Shana will answer this one.
Well, I would like to suggest that we take that question to the general discussion moment, which is after the last video of Museum M. These are all great questions, which we will dive into, and we will take them with us. But I suggest we take a look at the last video now, if that's okay. But I think it's okay, so I'm going to play it.
We zijn hier in Museum M in Leuven. Museum M bestaat sinds 2009, maar de meeste mensen kennen het als, van vroeger toch als Museum van der Kelen-Mertens. Het oude stedelijke museum van Leuven dat sinds 2009 een hele transformatie heeft ondergaan. Wij hebben een collectie die eigenlijk van de archeologie tot vandaag loopt. Hè. Dus een hele ruime collectie die bijna 3000 jaar omspant. Maar ons zwaartepunt qua collectiewerking ligt vooral bij de middeleeuwen en de 19e eeuw.
Ook bijzonder aan ons museum, en dat is dan vooral vanuit mijn blik ook wel fijn om even te vertellen, is dat wij heel publieksgericht zijn. Wij zetten echt in op de beleving van het publiek, op dialoog met de toeschouwer, ook op participatie. Wij zetten tentoonstellingen op met het publiek. Dus we gaan daar echt heel actief mee aan de slag.
Wij waren eigenlijk heel geïnteresseerd toen de oproep kwam van de werkplaats Immaterieel Erfgoed. Toen zij hun project rond ICE inbegrepen, Immaterieel Cultureel Erfgoed inbegrepen, lanceerden. En ze waren op zoek naar proeftuinmusea. Musea die niet per se met immaterieel erfgoed bezig zijn, maar zich toch wouden inzetten in een traject, een soort denkproces, creatief traject ook, om te bekijken van wat kan ICE voor dit museum betekenen en omgekeerd, wat kan dit museum voor ICE gaan betekenen.
Ik was vanuit publiekswerking ook wel meteen heel geïnteresseerd, omdat wij vanuit publiekswerking wel heel erg bezig zijn, ook samen met de collectie, om de verhalen naar het publiek te vertellen die onze werken vertellen. Dus ik ging er ook een beetje vanuit, ja, dat zal wel op de grens zitten met dat immaterieel cultureel erfgoed. Maar gaandeweg in heel het proces heb ik toch wel geleerd dat het wel veel meer is dan dat, wat het wel is, wat het niet is. Maar ook wel overeenkomsten gezien. En in al die sessies hebben we eigenlijk samen met die collega's ook wel nagedacht, gekeken van wat kan dat nu betekenen, het immaterieel cultureel erfgoed, vooral in een beeldende kunstmuseum als M, dat was onze focus. Want bij een ander museum heb je vaak al erfgoedgemeenschappen die gelinkt zijn aan het museum. Bij ons was dat toch een beetje zoeken, omdat het heel specifiek is, omdat we ook zo'n diverse collectie hebben.
Het heeft eigenlijk een aantal sessies geduurd voor we door hadden dat we eigenlijk op zich al wel een link hebben met een immaterieel cultureel erfgoedgemeenschap in Leuven. En dat is het jaartallenleven in Leuven. Dat is iets wat nog heel actief is. Elk jaar is er een nieuwe groep die ontstaat naar aanleiding van het geboortejaar, waarin ze allemaal geboren zijn en dan 40 worden. Zij maken een soort uniform voor zichzelf, een soort kostuum dat ze ontwerpen. En wat ze ook elk jaar doen, is dan ook een kostuumpje maken voor Fonske, de mascotte van Leuven, een beeld dat hier iets verder op het plein staat. En wij bewaren die kostuumpjes, wij helpen de mensen van het jaartallenleven om die goed te bewaren, geven hen advies over reiniging en zo. Dus eigenlijk deden wij dit al, ondersteunen wij als museum sowieso al een immaterieel cultureel erfgoedgemeenschap.
Nu gaan we kijken, kunnen we die verder opbouwen, specifiek ook vanuit publiekswerking. Kunnen we nog meer inzetten op die erfgoedgemeenschap? En kunnen we dat ook ontsluiten in het museum zelf, naar onze andere bezoekers? Dat vind ik ook wel interessant. Hoe kan je dat verhaal, hoe kan je met de gemeenschap een band opbouwen, maar hoe kan je dat verhaal ook nog vertellen naar uw andere bezoekers?
Naast het verder uitbouwen van wat we al aan het doen zijn met het jaartallenleven, willen we in de toekomst ook samen met de erfgoedcel van Leuven onderzoeken wat voor ambachten, gelinkt met de collectie, want we zijn een kunstcollectie, maar we hebben beeldhouwwerk, zilverwerk, noem maar op, zaken die echt een ambachtelijke kunde vereisen. We willen gaan onderzoeken welk van die ambachten er in Leuven nog uitgeoefend worden door een erfgoedgemeenschap. En daar dan in de mate van het mogelijke dat in kaart brengen en ook eventueel een project mee doen in het museum samen met de erfgoedcel. Dus dat wordt heel boeiend.
Sometimes it's right in front of you. This was a revelatory journey with Museum M. Thank you so much, Marjan, Debaene and Hauwermeiren. And I think Marjan is here with us to answer questions, whether there are any questions. We will also take into account the questions we researched earlier before we head to the coffee break. So if there are any questions right now for Museum M in Leuven, please shout or raise your hand or put it in the chat. No questions at the moment, but we did receive some questions earlier. And I think it's also really important to look back on the 4 cases we just saw, because they really showcase the diversity of museums and the diversity of dealing with the ICH in the collection. We were very pleased also having Museum M as a visual arts museum included in this selection. So that was really an important asset. We had some questions earlier of Ariane, who asked whether the Learning Network did receive or conceive a standard procedure and technical means to record testimonies. Maybe that's a question for us, for Shana, or for some of the museums, but I didn't think it was included in the scope of this project. Shana, do you agree, or does anyone agree? Or Ariane, maybe you can elaborate on where the question comes from. But I do not have a visual on Ariane.
I suggest we go to the next question then, and maybe when Ariane is back with us. Oh, is she? Oh no, it's Jorijn. Sorry, Jorijn. Go ahead.
Maybe I can have a short answer. It was not a part of this project, but I think a lot of knowledge about testimonies and how to record them and what you put into on paper to have the rights on and things like that are you can find them in the heritage units, because a lot of them work with oral history, and also in oral history as a academic way of working, they have these contracts on how to go about that, and I think that could be useful in this question.
Jorijn?
Yeah, maybe, but I think Shana can tell more about it. But what we learned through the project is that many museums approach these ways of documenting living heritage as traces from ICH, and that can be one way of integrating it, again, also in relation to data and collection management. And I guess the presentation we will have from Bert later on, from Meemoo, answers part of this question, because there we really dove into the questions of how can you approach this in a digital way with the collection management, the digital management systems that already exist, and how could we make first steps to finding standardization for museums in that regard. So we will get into that topic later on.
Yeah, and I can also add that your question, Ariane, was actually one of the many questions that we got during the surveys, and also during the workshops and the starting conference in Tilburg, because there is no standard procedure. Everyone does it at their own expense, at their own availability. Many museums use Excel to record the transcripts of the interviews. Many use tutorials, which we will later on when we're launching the Dynamic Knowledge Hub. But it's a very good question, because it's exactly the type of question about different ICH that has been asked throughout the project by every type of museum, and it's something that we still have to look into. And Jorijn was corrected. It relates to a presentation from Bert, which we will get after the break, I guess.
Thank you, Jorijn, Shana. We still have the question lingering from Chantal earlier about how intangible heritage is living heritage, but there are also many traditions and practices from the past which are no longer alive today. how to make a difference between living and past practices documented in your collection plan. I think it's a question directed at the 4 of the Living Labs. And I think I see a raised hand by Marjan. Do you want to answer this one? Please
Hello.
do.
Yes.
Hello, Marjan.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we do.
Okay, fantastic. Hello, everybody. I immediately raised my hand because, in fact, that was one of the things that was a big part of our trajectory during this project, as we, in fact, thought we had a very big link in the beginning of the project with intangible heritage, as we have in our collection a lot of objects relating to, for instance, processions or habits from the past in Leuven, but which are not being practiced anymore. And for us, that was kind of the eye-opener in the project, in the beginning of the project, in understanding really what intangible heritage is and what it isn't, and all these, how I would say, relics from the past, sometimes quite literally, are no part of intangible heritage unless there is somebody really still working and practicing with it. So all these processions that are no longer working or no longer going out every year, for us, it was not a link to intangible heritage. So we started with a big idea that we had a lot in common with intangible heritage. And in fact, at the beginning of the project, we had to realize that, in fact, it was not so. So that's really the difference, or the division we had to make between living and no longer living heritage. Is that an answer? I don't know. It's a experience.
Chantal, did it answer your question? Did Marjan
yes,
answer?
Yes. I was just wondering how the 4 museums approach that, and it was a very good answer. Thank you.
Maybe one of the other Living Labs would like to answer. I don't know, Sigrid, Davy.
Yes, I would like to pick in.
Else, yeah,
possible. Yeah, okay. It's indeed a very tricky question because especially when we're talking about the topic of alcohol, alcoholic drinks, and the ethical circumstances, it's not. I always give the example of the mailman or the postman. We give a drink on New Year's Day, on the day after New Year's Day. What was a tradition in Flanders, in Belgium, the last decades, but nowadays it's not done. It's to hand over an alcoholic drink to someone who's working. So, but it was a tradition. But the tradition is not. Nowadays it's not common anymore, and it's completely not done. So we think we have to certainly divide our intangible. We have to create another sort of heritage. We're talking about material collection, non-material collections, tangible collections, intangible collections. In Dutch, we call it ontastbaar. Not tangible. It's not the same as intangible, I think. It's a discussion on terminology. But when we discuss it in the workshops, I remember that Jorijn told us heritage can be dynamic, and maybe some period it's sleeping, but in the next decade it can be awakened or something. So it's something you have to decide for each practice next to one another. So there's not one answer to this question. You have to look at the different practices separately, I think, and it depends on the practice.
Thanks. Else?
And we take that in our collection management, when we are developing our policy.
That's great. Thank you, Davy. Else, would you like to add?
Yes, I would like to answer because
I just thought in our collection policy, we have the material, the digital collections, and next in another chapter of our collection policy, we have a chapter about ICH. And actually, this question was one of the inspirations to do it like this. Because sometimes it's not that easy for a tradition is still existing or doesn't exist, because sometimes traditions are looking so different, but they have the same base or the same inspirations, but we don't recognize them any longer as a follow-up from the tradition. For instance, with nowadays, nobody marriages like we did at the beginning of the 20th century, or when a child is born, we don't celebrate it like in the beginning of the 20th century. Only the common part is there is a marriage or a baby is born, but we do it totally different. But when you describe the traditions and so on, you don't recognize them as we celebrate the same thing. And therefore it's very dangerous to, as a museum, label something as it doesn't exist anymore. It's a very dangerous thing to do. Of course, when there is a tradition like ICH that, and for us, it's an important tradition that it's about living heritage. For some issues we are dealing with in the museum, but from the point of view of collection management, and that was the reason we don't describe it as a type of a collection. So it's something we're really dealing with it, and sometimes it's collection management, and it's not always that important. It can be important for other things. But for collection management, for instance, we are preparing now the exhibition on the streets about parades, about demonstrations and so on. But in this exhibition, we will show traditions at parades that only exist a few years, but some have already a tradition about 100 years, and some doesn't exist anymore. But in this in the exhibition, they are on the same level. It's the dynamic Davy just mentioned also, and so you have to be aware when is it important to label it as ICH and to focus it's still a living tradition, or when is it the dynamics I want to mention or to put the spotlights on. So it's collection management. You really have to deal with this.
Thank you, Els, Davy. Some other additions in the chats. Monica says, maybe we might rather say that ICH still has a social and cultural function, and this is what gives it a certain value. It doesn't only depend on the way or frequency. It does not only depend on the way or frequency a certain ICH practice is practiced. This can vary since it is living heritage. It's a useful remark. I do not know whether someone would like to react on this. Or maybe you want to elaborate on it, Monica, but then we are heading towards our coffee break. And there's another question. There's also a tip for oral history from Els Bates. That's the oral history part. Thanks for the tip, but we would like to focus more today on the ICH part, but every tip is welcome. Thank you, Els. Jorijn already, she answered some questions about the institution, about recording, question of Ariane, and there's a new question of Adriaan. How does your museum work on reactivating the appreciation for the taste and drinking of Genever among the communities? Do you do that in action? Do you consider a museum has to influence people's taste and traditions? I think that's a tough one. I think we touched the subject also of how to handle ethical problems like drinking alcohol as a museum. Davy, maybe you want to answer this question, and then I suggest we go to a non-alcoholic coffee break.
Yes. Reactivating the appreciation for a taste. First of all, we try to focus on craftsmanship. Which has to stimulate appreciation of the drink you're drinking. It's not just in case of Genever or gin of any other spirit. It's not just a shot you drink. There's a whole story behind the glass, and it's that craftsmanship that we emphasize in our museum, in our exhibitions, in our workshops. We have different tastings, workshops in which we work around taste appreciation, learning how to appreciate spirits inspired by slow food, the slow food movement. But on the other hand, we also pay attention to the other side of the story, of course, because spirits, and in this case, Genever was also a source of misery, of poverty during all the centuries. Even now, when Genever is in the news, it's most of the time bad news because of the drunkenness of people. People getting hospitalized because of overdose of alcohol. So also in our museum, we pay attention, if we focus on the impact of alcohol on your body, on your behavior, on your mind. So we bring all those stories, and so we try to in a way to sensibiliseren. How do you say it in English? We try to make people conscious of the positive side of alcohol, of Genever, but also of the possible negative aspects of the drink during history and in actual nowadays. The most beautiful example I can give is in a month. During the third weekend of October, our city organizes the Genever Festival, and the whole city is drinking Genever. But also in that weekend, there is many attention to drinking safely, and well, it's not always easy, but we focus on both sides of the story.
Thank you for elaborating on that, Davy. I think we deserve a well-deserved coffee break, whether you add a shot of Genever or not. That's up to you. It's Friday. I think we will. We do have another question. I suggest we keep that. Shana, can we do that? Can we keep it for later? Because we have been working for almost 2 hours now, so I think we deserve a nice coffee. And we will go on with a digital test case explanation by Bert from Meemoo. So we keep these questions. We're very pleased with how many questions are pouring in. Thank you so much. And we'll see each other at, I think, 3:05, 3:05. Shana, okay? Then we still do have a little break.
Great.
So we'll see you at 3:05, 3:05. Wow, that's a difficult one. Voilà. See you.
Enjoy your break.
So I hope you did enjoy the break and the first part of our conference. It was a pleasure to learn more and to speak with our Living Labs museums. The discussion that followed already gave us many more future questions to explore and lots of topics to explore within the learning network that had been established around this project. So that's really something for the future. We do have some more questions in the chat, but I suggest we keep them after we have this chat, this discussion after the next two speakers. So now I'm happy to introduce a specialist who guided us through the difficult question on how to digitally
collect and register ICH in our museums. So it's not only a way of wanting to integrate this in the collection plan, but also we looked further to how you can describe and how you can collect digitally these ICH practices in your collection. And Bert Lemmens from the Meemoo Institute, I think he will introduce Meemoo himself, will guide us through this part of the project we executed. Please, Bert, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. First, going to share my screen. Can you see this?
Yes, we can.
Okay, and you can hear me loud and clearly.
Yes, we do.
Let's start off then. Okay, I'm going to focus a bit on the more technical aspect of this project. And as Jana already said in the introduction, when you try to integrate immaterial intangible heritage practices or intangible heritage in your museum working, you also bump into the problem of recording intangible heritage. And as at least all of the museums that are were part of the project are working with digital information systems, being spreadsheets, whether a real collection management system, there was also the question from, okay, how do we record information about intangible heritage along the information we record about tangible material heritage? Of course, this question, you already talked a lot about the importance of involving living heritage communities into the working of your museum. And of course, this also provides with a perfect opportunity to pit museums once more against communities, because both tend to read this question about recording immaterial along material cultural heritage in a very narrow way. From the side of the museums, narrow reading would be like, okay, where does this information fit in my collection management system? Tell me where are the fields where I have to record this information. While the focus of communities is more like, okay, am I as a community or as a practitioner properly represented by the data recorded by museums? Of course, for the sake of the argument, the discussion, I'm doing this here. In real life, the situation is much more mixed. Museum workers are part of communities or heavily linked with communities. Also, members, practitioners can be experts, of course. But just for the sake of this discussion, you could say that both have different sensibilities, different expectations, and on how you record the information about intangible heritage along the information about material heritage. So this part of the project was basically about finding a kind of common vocabulary, terminology to link on one side information about properties of heritage objects, the things we keep in our storage rooms, and then on the other side, link that to information about how we use these objects and what is the context in which these objects are used. And of course, part was about stricto sensu terminology, which words we use, what kind of things we wanted to describe to record, what kind of events we want to record. But we also thought that part of the solution was in the way we structure this information. So go more to a technical level. And we came to this because most of the systems that we are using today in museums are basically thinking from a system of tables, tabular information, where you have all the different records, where you have records, lines in a spreadsheet that collect all the information about one object, for example. And that kind of system has little flexibility. It's very difficult to open these kind of systems up to describing other kind of entities, like immaterial cultural heritage practices. And one idea we had and one strategy we thought was to look in another way of structuring data, which is implemented in a different generation of database systems, graph databases, which have become quite widespread in other domains, mainly dealing with data mining or with social media, and which does not structure information in tables, but more in networks, in loose networks of associations. That seems like a very abstract theoretical thing, but there was a very concrete incentive for us to walk that route. And it had to do with a Flemish metadata standard that was published around the time we wrote this project. And that standard is the Oslo Application Profile for Heritage Objects and Events. I should tell you a little bit about Oslo, because Oslo is a set of standards specified and maintained by the Flemish government, which are published to ensure, to advance the exchange of information between government bodies. So these standards touch on all different levels of Flemish government, also the heritage fields. And what I actually do is define application profiles, so sets of properties and elements, information elements, which should enable then the exchange of information between government bodies. And they're very generic application profiles for organizations, describing organizations, but also places, addresses in the Flemish region. And at the time we wrote this project, there were two application profiles being written, one for describing heritage objects and one for describing heritage events. And both are actually graphs. These are sets of entities and properties that allow you to describe the relations between heritage objects and different other entities. These standards, Oslo standards, okay, they're Flemish standards, but they're not like written from scratch. They're not invented from nothing. They are always based on existing models. And in this case, there were two important domain ontologies models that were used. And if you're familiar with linked data and graphs, you probably, in the heritage field, you probably know these names, but this is about Silox CRM and FARO domain ontology. So actually these Oslo application profiles are subsets of properties and elements taken from these two domain ontologies. And actually, this gave us kind of a blueprint for experimenting on how material objects and immaterial heritage practices could be linked to each other. How did we do this? We organized 3 workshops. A first workshop where we did kind of, which was a kind of brainstorm, where we discussed with museum professionals about the terminology, so which entities we should record, notability, what information is relevant in the context of a museum to record in a system, and also what kind of environment do you expect you can catalog this, and how we are going to involve heritage communities into this environment. What kind of tools do you actually need? Second workshop, we proposed a draft model. Museum professionals, workers could respond to that model, give feedback, and then we came back in the third workshop with the second iteration of the model. And at that time, everyone came with his own set of data and his own collection objects and practices, what they wanted to describe or to record, and applied that to the model. How did that look in real life? I'd like to share with you. So this brainstorm was partly about very practical problems. And if we listen to the needs of museums and catalogers in museums, then there was a question of, okay, tell us what is the minimum standard? Of course, we lack resources. We have limited resources to spend to intangible heritage. What's the bare minimum we should record? But also a practical question like, how do we deal with privacy sensitive information? Because this information related to heritage communities come with a lot of privacy sensitive information. How do we deal with that in a collection management system? And I think that was already a question that was coming by in the chat box. Found, okay, we do not only record the items and the practices, but we also create a lot of documentation in the form of video interviews, audio interviews, pictures, which are not strictly collection items, which are perhaps also not collection representations, because that taking pictures of collection objects we also do, but we also have really like documentation of immaterial cultural heritage practices. How do we integrate that in our systems? And of course, from our side, modeling this graph, we also had some problems. Like in the talks, we had the things we heard from museum professionals. There was a concept that passed by, which caused a lot of questions, which was probably also the solution to the problem, but which we had to define further, which is the word like stories. There's people talk a lot about stories, stories that link objects to immaterial cultural heritage practices. Now, how do you model that story category? Another thing that was raised in one of the previous questions, okay, practices change over time. How do we record changes in our systems? And when it comes to sharing information, because also this Oslo standard is about being able to share information between institutions, which part of this information is open and can we easily share with each other? So we organized a kind of brainstorm around these. Well, these are part of the questions we discussed there. And we came up with a first draft model. I should say that this draft model was not based on the standards I mentioned. So there's no CDOC CRM or Oslo in this first model. This was basically listening to museum professionals and what vocabulary did they use, and try to put that in a kind of model which we could later easily implement in which you could possibly implement in the system. So this was, we tried to reflect the vocabulary, the existing vocabulary of the museum professionals, and then invited them to respond to this and look to their own needs, their own practices, and if this model was sufficient. And of course, in that second workshop, we ran into a lot of questions and problems with this model. This distinction between stories on one side and items, so the things that are probably in your storage room, was not that clear. What do you do with biographies or legends? These are also stories, but not kind of stories in the sense of events, things that happen, where heritage communities are involved in. So how do we model this? That was not completely clear. And another thing is the distinguish between collection items and what we called at that time captations, where we were thinking of video, audio recordings. Sometimes they're not, you can't clearly distinguish between. In some cases, the collection item is a document or a captation of a cultural heritage practice. So these were the problems we ran into. There are plenty of other problems. I just show you, for example, these were two that caused actually we had to break up our model. And that's what we went to the third workshop where we developed this model. And actually, by solving this problem step by step, we also introduced some of the entities and properties coming from these Oslo and CDOC CRM and further models. Because in these blueprints, this domain ontology, most of these problems were already solved. And it was actually an opportunity to bring museum professionals, bring them in contact with these concepts, which, if you read them from the specification, are terribly abstract. CDOC CRM is notoriously abstract to read as a document. But if you can link them immediately to the problems you have, applying your own example or your own information to that model, it's much easier to understand why specific entities and properties are there. So we ended up with a much more complex model, and that scared us a bit because, of course, the next question is this still workable? Can museum professionals still work with these entities, and can they distinguish between what is a concept, an idea, a performance plan, or an expression? Because they are very abstract categories. And that's what we tested in the third workshop, where, and I remember, I don't know which wave of Corona wave, it was the second or the third, which we had to do digitally, which was also a challenge. So we used a kind of online scrapboard to let everyone be creative and draw its own models based on some of default categories we defined. So I'm showing you some of the works of art we created during that workshop. Museum participants in the workshop creating their own model with their own piece of heritage. Of course, it's in Dutch, but just to show you the scope of what we did there, we had in total 14 to 15 of these models. going from modeling religious processions and the people involved in these processions and the difference between different editions of the processions to common social practices, like here another brandy Jenever, I don't know the English word anymore, tradition or practice, like using cubes of sugar as a cure for toothaches, for example. How do you, that social habit, how do you model that in data? To very traditional crafts. In this, I think it's embossing, metal embossing, for example, and distinguish between how that practice is executed by specific workshops and the people working in these workshops. So where did we end at the end? Where did you come at the end of this workshop? The point where we are now is we think we were able to define this common vocabulary. We were able to find a way to link the practice of recording properties of objects, what you need in collection management, what you're basically doing in collection management, with recording the use of an object in a very integer, correct, scientifically correct, authentic way. And we have now a set of 14 user cases. They are actually the 14 first ones we had. So this is, we have this pile of user cases, and don't underestimate it because it's really important for implementers, because we have now a set of information we can also share with people developing systems to have a look at this. Like, how would you go if you want to create a system, a database system, or a tool for recording immaterial cultural heritage? But that's for the next stage, basically. What we are going to do to finish this part is develop this set of minimum cataloging guidelines, specifically for use in our own collection management system, because on short term, that will be the place where links and associations with immaterial cultural heritage practice will be recorded. But in the next stage, we will look into possible implementations of this graph that we created now. And there are still a lot of open questions there. What kind of system will this be? Will this be the collection management system? We can now go and discuss with providers, developers, and companies delivering these collection management systems to you. Or should we go for a completely new kind of database system, a more graph-based system? Will this be a system that is running in your own institution? Or, because these practices are by default shared between different collections and different communities, is this something that should be recorded in a shared system? This is still to be discussed. And how does this new system integrate with the existing collections management system and content management system? Because of course, you will still use your collection management system because you have a physical collection to manage, and probably more and more museums have separate systems to manage all the audiovisual image resources they preserve themselves or collect themselves. So that's where we are now at the end of this project. That's more or less my story. Are there any questions?
Now the question that I would like to add, that together with Meemoo, we are writing a report about these sessions, and this will also be translated into English and put up on our dynamic hub.
Thank you, Shana. Thank you, Bert. I haven't seen any questions yet. Just a second, I'm checking. I think people need to let this sink in. It's a lot of information because it was a great phase in our project, and it still has so much. It promises so much, but there's still a lot of unanswered questions, just like Bert said. So also this is a kind of a firm foot and a firm start towards thinking about how to digitalize the registration of ICH. I would love to thank thank Bert. We received some questions, or must I say remarks in the chat, but I think it's more about something we can discuss later on after the keynote we will be listening to now, because it's especially about endangered crafts. I think we can answer this because there are a lot of other initiatives focusing on that. For example, I see Veerle and Shana have already answered some of the concerns, but maybe we can talk about it later if there's still time. Bert, thank you so much. We will keep in touch when there are still questions arriving, or when there's someone who likes to know more about it. But thank you for this clear presentation about a difficult topic. Our next guest is a really special guest. All guests today are special, but we are very pleased to welcome amongst our midst Pip Laurenson, who is the head of the collection care research of Tate, of the Tate's collections, Tate in London, UK. She's head of collections care research and holds a special chair as a professor in art collection and care at the University of Maastricht, with her neighbors in the Netherlands. Moreover, she has more than 20 years experience in conservation of contemporary art, but also establishing and leading the pioneering media conservation section of the Tate Museum. And since 2010, she took up the current role as head of collection care research. With this research, Pip is also leading the initiative Reshaping the Collectible, when artworks live in the museum. And this is the topic she will be telling us more about. So like Jorijn already said, it's not specifically focused on intangible heritage, but there's so much to learn because it's about keeping artworks and art alive and transforming and reshaping inside a museum's collection. So I think there's a lot to learn there. Pip, I hope you're there. Yes,
I am.
You are. Hi, that's great. So I suggest I give you the floor and welcome, and we're very happy to have you here.
Lovely, thank you very much. And a big thank you to the organisers for inviting me to speak today. I do hope that this is an opportunity to identify some synergies between the work in the Contemporary Art Museum, where conservators, curators, collection managers and archivists have been working to think about how to represent what might be thought of as ephemeral events within the museum. So I'm going to share my screen and hopefully, I need to be made a co-host, I think, to do that. And hopefully you'll see the connections between our work.
I think Shana can manage that. Yes, now it should work.
Oh, marvelous,
fine.
Brilliant. Thank you. Okay.
Yeah, we can see it.
Yes, great.
Yes.
Lovely. Super. Okay, so whilst I approach this very much from the perspective of a contemporary art context, I do think that there are questions and challenges that we share. So this first slide is an example from a work from 2016 in Tate's collection by Kevin Beasley, and it's called Your Face Is Not Enough. And these incredible masks are on display as sculptural objects, but also used as part of a performance. So we share the challenge of understanding how these objects should be used and transmitting the details of their use in the performance, as well as the challenge of caring for objects that change their status from sculpture to costume or prop. We also have works with complex dependencies on communities of practice outside the museum for their activation. So similarly, this work by Tara Katui called The Reverse Collection directly speaks to intangible heritage in that the work was inspired by instruments in the Technology Museum in Dahlem in Berlin. And basically, and I was enjoying the chat about skills around musical instruments, but in this case, Terika Tui was speaking to the director, and he discovered that in the majority of cases, instruments were preserved in ways that render them no longer playable, and where there are just no records of the sounds that they made. So working with a group of musicians, he asked them to play some of the instruments that were still playable and recorded the sounds. He then took the recordings to musical instrument makers who, without seeing the instrument that created the sound, made a new instrument. These new instruments from the artwork form the artwork. There we are, there's a couple of them. And are activated by different composers and musicians to realize new performances. As with many of your cases, the activation of these performance artworks rely on communities outside the museum. My paper will therefore look at the relationship of performance art and the museum and emerging strategies for its stewardship. The care of these works, which trouble ideas of the museum object, has been the subject of research for a number of years at Tate, triggered by the increase of complex installation works and the acquisition of live works into the collection. Some of these projects are worth mentioning as they provide resources which I hope will be of interest. And I'm going to put the links in the chat as we go. So let me just see if I can do that. Hold on, let me just open up the chat. Oh, here we go. Great. Okay, so the first, let me just put that one in, is a project called Collecting the Performative. And actually, I will just go to that slide as well, where you can also see the link. This was with Dr. Vivian van Saas from Maastricht University, which ran from 2012 to 2014. Also part of this project was an output that was called the Live List. These were prompts that served to capture things to consider when acquiring a live performance work. The second project that I'm going to flag is this one. So from the development of the Live List, this was picked up on and developed as a time-based media conservation project led by Louise Lawson. So working with Acacia Finbo and Duncan Harvey, Elia Marchel and Anna Ribeiro and Leah Kramer, they published the strategy for the documentation and conservation of performance. And then the next one I'm just going to flag, which I think is a useful resource, is a project that Tate was co-eye on, which was led by Gabriella Giannacci from Exeter University, which resulted in a major online publication called Performance at Tate Into the Space of Art. And then now we come right up to date with the project that was mentioned in the introduction very kindly. And we just completed this project called Reshaping the Collectible, When Artworks Live in the Museum, which continues to consider not only live performance works and their transmission, but also other types of ephemeral events, such as lecture demonstrations. And then final one link I'm going to share with you is this one. So this is basically, although I'm going to focus today on the museum's relationship with live works, also I think relevant to our discussions about intangible heritage is the work that we've been doing in collaboration with the artist Catherine Yass and the anthropologist Professor Heidi Geismer to make visible the networks of materials, technologies and skills underpinning contemporary photographic practice upon which artists like Catherine depend. So In this paper, I'm going to draw on all of this work to provide you with a short introduction to the collecting of live work in the museum and to discuss how the transmission of live work has been addressed. Oh, sorry, those were some of the slides that I should have been showing you. Okay, great. The acquisition of performance-based artworks as a live work is a fairly recent phenomenon within the Contemporary Art Museum, and not one without controversy. Rooted very much in a Western idea of knowledge and its transmission, Peggy Phelan's 1993 book, Unmarked: The Politics of Performance, offers an important reference point in this debate within the West, where Phelan strongly argues for the sacrosanct nature of the live, championing both ideas of immaterial and notions of live presence. And I quote, "Performance," she says, "cannot be saved, recorded, documented, or otherwise participate in the circulation of representations of representations. Once it does so, it becomes something other than performance." So for Phelan, only the life of performance is in its presence and its disappearance. For her, disappearance is the heart of its ontology. And she continues, "Performance in a strict ontological sense is non-reproductive. It is this quality which makes performance the runt of the litter of contemporary art. Performance clogs the smooth machinery of reproductive representation necessary to the circulation of capital," which is actually not a bad explanation as to why intangible heritage is hard to fit into our museums, actually. So both Rebecca Schneider in her book Performing Remains, Art and War in the Times of Theatrical Reenactment from 2011, and her earlier paper, Performing Remains from 2001, and Diana Taylor in her book The Archive and the Repertoire, Performing Cultural Memory in the Americas from 2003, among many others, have challenged an ontology of performance rooted in this idea of disappearance. And this sets the scene for artists to move away from the idea of performance as a one-off live event in which the artist's presence is central and which defied the potential to enter into a museum's permanent collection, to something that can be enacted over time, independent of the artist and indeed collected. So let's go back to the museum. Alongside the bringing of live works into the museum, artists have also continued to find diverse ways of representing their works in the gallery, which, for whatever reason, cannot be re-performed. This strategy, where elements create a palpable sense of the event, serves to insert these forms of artistic practice into the art historical narratives of the museum. So, for example, this is Rose English's work Quadrille, which was first performed, well, in fact, it was only performed twice on the same day in 1975 at a county show in England. In this performance, 6 dancers performed in a highly choreographed routine that drew analogies between ballet and dressage. The film created of the event by Rose English's brother, the photographs, ephemera for the event, and the costumes worn by the 6 performers all serve to create a work that brings the performance through these objects into the gallery. Rose English has described the performance as being the point of movement between these 2 still points. So there was an additional display, which she did just of the one costume that she had made for herself in a small exhibition in the UK. And then a performance happened as a result of exploring those ideas. And then the work came back to being this installation form that we see today. And the costumes, which you probably could see from this photograph, we've got horses' tails attached to a belt, and we've got these extraordinary shoes which were proper horses' hooves that she got from an abattoir. And she made these shoes, which have got these extraordinary sort of high heels, using and modifying, I think they were ice skating shoes. And these really are quite charismatic objects that bring a palpable sense of the performance into the room. And she talks about kind of almost sort of wanting them to make you think about what it might be to actually put these extraordinary costumes on. So since 2005, museums began to collect live work, acquiring the rights to re-perform works. This has been made possible in part by the fact that the works which are being acquired can be performed by those other than the artist, something that the art critic and art historian Claire Bishop has referred to as delegated performance. Bishop argues that the repeatability of delegated performances, particularly the hiring of non-professionals to do performance, is key to understanding the acceleration of the institutionalization and the ability of museums to collect performance. So alongside this has been a desire by museums to represent this aspect of artistic practice within the narrative of the museum, including its collection, resulting in a challenge to Phelan's perspectives on the reproducibility of performance. However, there are echoes of these debates in the view that liveness of performance is somehow a more authentic representation of performance art than is possible through objects. In 2004, Tate acquired the first live performance work into a museum collection. This was Roman Nondak's Good Feelings and Good Times. This was a fairly simple instruction piece where a random cue is activated. A work like this is not particularly challenging to collect. It's easy to loan, cheap to store, and easy to provide instructions for. However, other more complex performance works, such as Tina Chagall's This is Propaganda from 2002, which was acquired into the collection in 2005, or Tony Conrad's 10 Years Alive on the Infinite Plane from 1972 and acquired into the collection in 2019, have been more challenging and brought about developments in museum practice. So although not acquired until 2005, the artist and Tate have been in discussion about acquiring Tina Chagall's 2002 work, This is Propaganda, for a while. In this case, it was not only the liveness of the work which was a challenge, as much as the fact that the artist does not allow the work to be documented in any way and strives to ensure that there are no material remains of the work. This is in part to present the live work being replaced by a photograph or a video, but also from a desire to challenge traditional models of the museum and the market, which are based on the currency of objects. This, of course, presented challenges not only to our conservation and registration teams, but also to our legal team. The conservation of this work depends on memory and body-to-body transmission, a notion drawn from dance. Chagall is both trained as a dancer and a choreographer, as well as being trained in economics. So to describe This is Propaganda, it's best to do so from the perspective of a gallery visitor encountering the work. As you walk through the museum, you hear a rather beautiful melody. The singing has gone quiet, and as you enter the gallery, a uniformed female gallery assistant in her 50s faces you and then turns to face the wall and sings, "This is propaganda, you know, you know. This is propaganda." And on singing the final, you know, turns back to face you and recites the caption for the work, "This is Propaganda, 2002, acquired by the trustees of the Tate Gallery in 2005. And actually, I was going to sing that for you, but I realized if we did, it would be recorded by Zoom. And that would be the reference point, and I would have broken my contract. So only when the gallery assistant slowly turns to face the visitor on the last you know, is it clear that she's singing and that it is a live performance and not a recording. The visitor may ask a question and a discussion may ensue until someone else enters the gallery and the work is triggered again. And as you can see on the website, this work is represented somewhat sparsely. So as Dorothea von Hankelmann, art historian and curator, has noted, Chagall starts from an ephemeral event, like singing, moving, or speaking, lending it an object-like quality. This is propaganda takes on many of the forms of a material museum object. It has to be active during the opening hours for the duration of any display or exhibition of which it is part of. There is a purchase contract, albeit oral. The work is sold as a limited edition. Tate's curator of performance, Catherine Wood, has referred to his works as being the intangible and ephemeral, dragged up as an object. This model for collecting performance has been highly influential in how both the museum and artists think about the legacy of performance and their relationship to the museum. Tino Chagall has shown that the intangible can be collected, bought and sold, that they are repeatable, durable and portable. So let's consider this question of transmission. So the question initially was, what does it mean for the museum to learn this work to the extent that we're able to redisplay it without the artist being present? Initially, this meant the curator and the conservator thinking about the skills we had that would be of a value to this task and the skills that we didn't possess. Firstly, the artist was trained as both a dancer and a choreographer. Within dance, there is a rigid hierarchy, and the idea was for us to be able to act like a choreographer rather than learning the work by doing. This was difficult as we didn't have an understanding of the space and the movements involved. Personally, I became rather obsessed with not forgetting the tune. But when we invited some of the performers, which Chagall calls interpreters, who'd performed the work in 2006, to come back to the gallery in a moment of remembering in September 2012, what was striking was the way in which the movements and their capacity to take control of the space was a significant part of the activation of the work. It wasn't just about the song. It was clear watching them re-perform the movements that the movements and gestures were something I completely overlooked. I have no background in dance or theatre, and I realized gestures was something I hadn't thought about. And I'd failed to pay attention to in trying to remember the work because I didn't have the background expertise. Responsibility for these works also highlights a different form of commitment in terms of the time it takes to select, rehearse, and work with those who will be enacting the work. This piece is enacted by women, preferably over 40, who can sing but are not professional singers. Many of those who took part in the piece had been contacted through amateur choirs in London. It was challenging for these women to sing in the galleries on their own. And Tino does a great deal to build a relationship of trust, which is critical to developing the commitment of those participating in these works. Ensuring that they turn up and render the work day after day over a number of months. They are paid per hour for doing this, but that's not their motivation. In speaking to the artist 7 years after he began to sell works to museums, there was a realization from him of the inadequacy of a standard display cycle to keep the knowledge and memory of how the work is to be installed fresh. Instead, think of the producers who work directly for Tino. And not only do they have this background knowledge of dance and movement and theatre, but for them, this is a full-time job, not something they return to every 10 years or so, which quite often our works in our collection don't get shown for a number of years. As a museum worker, Chagall's work also makes you aware not only about the processes of learning a work, but also of the difficulties of passing on personal knowledge of a work, stripped of your normal tools, such as video and photography and other means of documentation at your disposal. You become aware of the significance of first-hand experience, which actually is important in the stewardship of complex contemporary artworks. This propaganda was also important in signalling our need in the museum to engage with that external expertise in the care of our works and to actually practice a letting go to that broader community. So this brings me to our most recent project. So Reshaping the Collectible When Artworks Live in the Museum is a 3-year research project at Tate, funded by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, which has embedded researchers in collection management, archives and records, time-based media conservation. It also has a researcher in art history and curatorial practice. We have 2 collaborative doctoral students and 4 academic fellows, supported by myself as project lead and our research manager. The project has also collaborated closely across the collection care division and also across the gallery with those in interpretation, visitor services, public programs, and audience research. This project has at its core the consideration of works which evolve and unfold over time, perhaps taking different forms at different times, works which question the boundaries of the archive, the artwork, and the record, and that rely on these complex networks of people that sit outside the museum. It is committed to contributing to both theory and practice. So you can learn more about this on our web pages, which I think, oh, I'll pop a link in. I think I popped a link in earlier, didn't I? And we are in the process of updating the web pages with publications from our research project. So Tony Conrad's 10 Years Live on the Infinite Plane is a live 90-minute work that was first performed in 1972 and was formed the first case study we looked at. It was most recently performed in Liverpool, Tate Liverpool, in 2019, and actually is going to be performed again in Geneva in, I think it's January or February next year. Whilst the work has within its life been performed in different configurations, at Tate Liverpool it was performed with 1 violin live and 1 recording of Conrad playing the violin, a bass guitar, a long string drone, which is an instrument that Conrad invented, and 4 film projections. It is not surprising in this pandemic-riven world that we're thinking about connectedness and the nature of those connections, nor is it surprising that we're thinking about what happens when people leave our socially entangled network. From the moment I encountered the work in 2017, it was very clear that our ability to successfully bring this work into Tate's collection was dependent on a wide variety of people. And people and things who had for many years sustained and cared for the work and whose responsibilities had shifted and continued to change since Conrad's death in 2016. These were performers of the work, curators, archivists, gallerists, producers, scholars, friends, and family, who through their different practices cared for the work, its memory, and the legacy of the work of Tony Conrad. These are obviously pre-pandemic pictures here from 2019. These were a trusted group of transmitters of the work, some of which had already had a group identity known as the Cooks, in reference to their connection to the independent media space, The Kitchen, in New York, where the work was first performed in 1972. The initial network emerged over a long duration, starting with the invitation by Rhys Chatham to Tony Conrad to perform at The Kitchen and connecting different people and places over the intervening years. For many, they also had professional roles tied up with this work. The network is reformed and often extended each time it's performed. Whilst Conrad was alive, He mixed those who were his friends, colleagues, and collaborators with those who were new to the work and local to the venue in which the work was performed, expanding the network. It also included instruments such as the long string drones, there were various examples of those, carpets, film material, diagrams, and clocks, all of which have their own stories. So as part of the Reshaping the Collectible project, we've worked to experiment with a methodology for the transmission of work where the artist is no longer present and where there's no score. Conrad was very anti-score. The first component was the construction of a dossier, which contains text, sound, video, and images. The information conveyed includes information to the performers that were tailored to each role. And it also contained information about Conrad himself. This dossier was provided to a new set of performers in Liverpool who had never performed the piece or performed with Tony Conrad. We also gathered a group of transmitters, one for each of those performance roles. We gave the new performers a day and a half to come together and rehearse, and then the next day they performed the work to the transmitters purely based on the dossier that they had been given. They weren't allowed to talk to them beforehand. What followed was a feedback session. We then got feedback from the new performers and the transmitters as to what had not been included in the dossier. For example, Time-Based Media Conservation went on to add much more detail to the instructions for the individual performers on tuning, for example. And a section was added for the sound engineer, a role that had been overlooked in the original dossier. And I will share at the end a video about this work because I don't think we've got time today to see it, which kind of explains a little bit more about the practice. So after all the preparation, the readying of the equipment and prints, the assembling of the spaces, the people, the testing, the shipping, the building, the unpacking, the tuning of instruments, the checking, oh, someone's in high winds. The performing of all these practices demonstrated the close attention to the specificity of the human and non-human material that makes up this work. Whilst the week culminated in a second public performance of the work, what had also been performed was conservation as a social activity involving people and things which extended beyond the museum, and also conservation and its associated practices as practices of care. Going forward, we're mindful that this case study has shifted our practice to work with more acknowledgement and awareness of the networks of care that surround and support artworks before they are considered for a collection, and also the dependency of these works on broader ecologies that included, in this case, an experimental music scene that provides us with the extraordinary young performers able to pick up the baton and keep 10 years alive on the infinite plane, alive for new audiences. We're preparing for publication a range of papers, including a methodology for the work we have done on transmission, which is now being implemented at Tate by Time-Based Media Conservation team, and also other important papers, such as a paper on memory ecologies by Dr. Helia Machel, the Conservation Fellow for Time-Based Media on the project, and a paper by the Registrar Stephen Heighton, looking at the status of the long string drone, an instrument used in performances, which is also an accession part of the artwork. So to wrap up, through our research, I think we have become less judgmental about the possibility of installations that take material elements to represent an ephemeral event, moving away from a kind of binary thinking about the live and the not live. I think we've also built our capacity to deal with complex live works, which depend on networks outside the museum. We've become more open to seeing the museum as entering an existing network and understanding the process from that perspective, rather than simply seeing it from the museum's viewpoint. And we've begun to reconsider our role in relation to the complex ecosystem of skills on which we rely. I think before this project, it was all too easy to think about works coming into our collection rather than think about how the museum was now becoming part of an existing network and ecology. Performance actually can be an extraordinarily resilient medium. And in ending, I want to share with you this last work. This photograph documents the first performance of a work called Time by David Lamellus in 1970, which was brought into Tate's collection in 2006. So a group of people stand in a line. The first person tells the time to the next person. They receive the time and hold on to it before announcing it to the next participant. The last person announces it to the world in a language of their choice. And this image shows time being performed in the French Alps. And then we performed the work in the Turbine Hall not that long ago and realized that nobody has watches anymore. So David had to walk up the line with a mobile phone, which is how most of us know what the time is. And then in 2020, here we have a Zoom version of the work being performed. And you can probably see David with his phone, still using that as his reference for time. So I'd like to thank you all for listening and thank the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation for their continued support of our work and all of these people listed. It's been very much a team effort involving many people both inside and outside the gallery. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much, Piep. You gave a lot of inspiration, a lot of examples. It's a lot to take in. Congratulations. So I'm not sure people already have questions, but they might pop up later, or we can always contact you and tell you all about it later. But I do remember, I think we have to retain the idea of the reproducibility and the non-reproductive matters that you discussed. And I think that's really a challenge that's also posed in dealing with ICH. So I think we can really relate to that. But I loved the examples as well. It was also a great journey on a Friday afternoon. Thank you so much. I can see, yeah, somebody is asking, Hilde Schoofs does have a question about the concept of memory ecology as being an interesting one. Whether you have some good resources on memory ecology. Maybe you can put resources in the chat or can respond to it now.
No, I'm happy to do that. I'm happy to share those resources. I think Elia's paper, which should be available in the next month, will give you all that you need to be able to navigate that question of memory ecologies. And so I'll put some of her references in there as well for you.
Thanks
for
that's
asking.
Great. I see Hilde saying thank you as well. Voila. Thanks. We were supposed to head to our next coffee break or maybe sanitary break. But there were still some remarks in the chat. I don't know, Shana, whether everything is covered by our colleagues. I'm just reading up a bit.
Yes, I think everything is
okay. Okay, great. Yeah, that's fine. So Pip, another thank you for your time, for being with us, for inspiring us, and I hope everything is okay back there. So I think we will be going to our next coffee break. Afterwards, we will hear Shana, who will launch our Dynamic Knowledge Hub, which is a great announcement. And then we have some closing reflections from FARO, and ICOM from Evelien and Sergio, and Sophie Elpers from the key knowledge center on intangible heritage. I have 2 more messages and people saying thank you, Pip. So you can read you can read in the chat how people liked it. Thank you very much. We'll see each other. Oh, you will stay. That's good. That's good to know. Thanks. So people will be here to answer more questions. I think we will. We're a little bit over time and not too much. I think at 4:15, Shana, we will start with you.
Yeah. Okay.
And that won't take too long. So I think we will get to our schedule again. Thank you. Okay. So those were already back.
Yes.
Great, you're back. The rest will enter. Shana.
Yes.
I think you are going to reveal something important.
Yes. Yes.
The way the project will live on in the form of a dynamic knowledge hub.
Thank you, Jana.
Please elaborate on that.
Well, throughout the project, we noticed that the network that we had set up was too important, too useful to just let it end together with the project itself. So at the workshop Intangible Heritage, and together, of course, with all the partners and the museums involved in the project, we asked them, do you want to keep on doing this learning network? Do you want to keep this going forward in the future? And maybe get some other issues involved as well, like ICH and the policy plan of an entire museum and so forth. Luckily, unfortunately for us, the museums all said, yes, we would love to continue this learning network. So we decided to make it something structural. And instead of a publication, and I should mention the ICH and Museums book that was published last year, I think in 2020, correct me if I'm wrong, Jorijn, is a great base, of course, for how museums can go about contacting ICH communities on how they can get involved with ICH as a museum. But of course, this project really focused on the collection plans and collection policy plans of museums. And it's an entirely different facet. So we decided, because the learning network will stay alive, we'll keep on learning, we decided to create a dynamic knowledge hub on the website of Intangible Cultural Heritage. I will now drop a link, if it's possible, send to everyone, yes. I will now drop a link to the Dynamic Knowledge Hub, and I will also share my screen. On our website, I don't see anyone anymore. Okay, now I see. Does everyone see my?
We do.
Okay, great. Here we have the main page of the Dynamics Knowledge Hub. We've been calling it a living publication in Dutch because we are going to treat it as something that lives on and that will be updated all the time during the remainder, during the rest of our work with museums. As you can see some information about the project itself, the partners. This is also the place where the final report will be uploaded. And, and especially it will be translated into English. As you can see, the Dynamic Knowledge Hub is in English here, but that's because you can choose another language. The original one is in Dutch, but you can also do it in your own language just by Google Translate. And as you can see, it works rather well. So here you can find almost everything that has happened within the project itself. We can focus on certain aspects that has come about, like Pip's talk, other workshop themes that have been very important. Also the test case, digital registration. This will be updated after we've, of course, reviewed the closing conference, this one, and will act as something dynamic, something that we can link to all over the internet with other museums, with other projects. Yes, okay, great. As you can see, we've made also other pages, sites, mini sites about each of the Living Lab museums. You can just click on them, and as you can see here, which I will show you later, there will be the information about the trajectory of the Living Lab museums. I don't think that most of them have seen this yet, so it is a surprise for them as well. One thing I would like to highlight is the column Tell Us About It. Tell Us About It is a column about how participants of the learning network will not get started, but how do they start on getting ICH integrated? What have they learned? What have they gained by participating in the project? So here will be some more information. This is just an example. There will be many, many more. If I'm going too fast, I'm sorry. I'm just excited. So here, everything, all the reports, infographics will be available here. So please keep an eye on this one. If you want to be updated about the things going on this site, you can always subscribe to our newsletter. I will just scroll not too fast to the end of our page here. And then you can subscribe to the newsletter, where we will let you know when the final report will be uploaded and whenever other things are added. Another one, here's an example of the mini site of the Jenevermuseum experimental garden. You can see we have used some diary-esque style of writing just to show how it's been for the museums and the team members to participate in this project. How were they at the start of the project? How do they look to it right now? And what are they going to do in the future? Of course, all the videos will be on here. Some other information which could be interesting that was not in the project per se, but links to it and so forth. As you can see here, some behind the scenes pictures as well. This is Master Distiller Steven. He is giving a live presentation to the members of the Learning Network on how to taste the soul of the Genever. Also some safeguarding measures, which is translated badly right here. And also what is there still to be done. And as we say, it's always to be continued. Then the next one is the Hof van Busleyden testing ground. But of course, when you have the link, you just click on everything. Everything has a link. We like to connect as many things as possible. Here you can also see other videos, the people behind the practices who help the museum with how they go about. So I would kindly invite you to take a look around. I'm also just showing some other languages here. So we have French, we even have Finnish. So really it's a dynamic knowledge hub for everyone. Everyone can read it, everyone can subscribe. And we invite you to, even if you want to tell us about it, what you're going to do, even if it's in English, preferably in English, Dutch or English. Yeah, French is also possible, so that we can continue to build this hub so that more and more museums can find this resource, this tool, because we consider it as a real tool instead of just publishing a book or making an infographic. We thought the experience of the museums and the living labs and what happened and how it happened and what kind of methods we used was as much as important as the theoretical background of it all. So this was the launch of it. This was the first time we've ever shown it to everyone, to someone. And of course, you can tell us about it, but we'd also appreciate it if you told other people about it. So thank you very much and happy exploring.
Thank you, Shana, and for revealing this great experiment. It's a good thing that we also keep it alive as the way ICH is continuously reformed and expanding and changing. So the way we conceive this publication is also a way of reflecting that. I don't know if there are any people are saying goodbye and nice to have seen you all. Ineke, thank you. Some people have to leave. We know it's a Friday afternoon, so we won't take much of your time anymore, but we do have some great next speakers coming up. Partners actually of our network who have some conclusions on the project, the way they lived it. The first one is Evelien Doesselaere. We have been working a lot with Evelien since she's the advisor on intangible heritage for FARO, the Flemish Institution for Cultural Heritage. They support heritage professionals, help them flourish, and for example, we develop some courses on ICH with them, with Evelien, and she's also the communication manager on all things intangible heritage for FARO. Evelien, the floor is yours. We are very happy to have you, and we are very curious about how FARO and you regard the outcomes of this project. Please.
Thank you, Jana. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Jana and the entire team of the workshop Intangible Heritage for the opportunity to speak here on what has been a very interesting afternoon. Thank you to all the speakers sharing their insights and their experiences, showing that this was a very rich project. Thank you, Pip, for your inspiring keynote. And before diving into the subject of today, I want to say a few words on FARO. Jana already mentioned some things on FARO, the organization I work for those who doesn't know us. We are, as mentioned, the Flemish Institution for Cultural Heritage. This means we work on movable and intangible heritage. Our government in Flanders makes a distinction between what we call cultural heritage, movable and intangible heritage, and immovable heritage, monuments and landscapes. We are an intermediary organization and we form the bridge between the Flemish government, which determines the heritage policy and grants funding, and the cultural heritage field in Flanders and Brussels, museums, archives, heritage libraries, heritage cells, centers of expertise, and so on. And we work closely together with these heritage workers within those organizations, and we organize heritage training programs. For example, on intangible heritage, we offer advice as well as tailor guidance to heritage workers so that they can develop and deepen their heritage practice. We invest in research so we can share national and international views insights, and practices. In everything we do, we pay attention to movable and intangible heritage. For example, together with partners in the Netherlands and Brussels, we published a small guide for museums on how to write a collection plan. And in this guide, we also reflect upon intangible heritage in museum collections. And of course, our collaboration in this project is also to be seen in this light of an integrated approach to cultural heritage. Which brings me to the subject of today's conference, and I would very much like to congratulate Shana, the entire team of the Werkplaats, the workshop, the living lab museums, and all the museums and partners who were involved in this project with the course and the result of it. 25 museums in Flanders were involved, showing that there's a great interest in how a living heritage can be integrated in collection planning and management in museums. Your presence here and the many questions in the chat are also proof of this interest. For some museums, it was a first encounter with intangible heritage. Other museums already had a great deal of experience, and this project gave them the opportunity to spread and deepen their knowledge. During this project, there was room for experiment, and we all know how scarce the time for experiment is, so that's very valuable. Practice development, knowledge exchange in the many discussions between the museums, and peer-to-peer learning, which is a very strong way of learning with very much impact. So it's very valuable and important that time is made for this, because among other things, it contributes to the further development of our sector. So I'm very happy to hear that this project doesn't stop here, but that the learning network will continue and that this pilot project will be embedded within the operation of the workshop. And what an impressive knowledge hub, I have to say. I look forward to browse through it more. And of course, we will communicate about it. And we were asked to reflect upon this project. And the main question I would like to discuss with you is, what does this project learn us about the relationship between intangible heritage and museums in Flanders and Brussels today? Traditionally, museums are focused on tangible objects, on material collections. Recently, however, we see that the museum as an institution is being approached in a much more broader way. The museums we just heard and those who were involved in the project, PIP's Keynote, are proof of this development. Attention for all things intangible is increasing, not only here in Flanders and Brussels, but on an international level. The ongoing discussion about the new icon definition also demonstrates this. And we can ask ourselves, why is this? How does this come? And of course, it's too early to speak about a hard causal link, which requires research, but we do see a number of factors that explain this increased attention. First off, the cultural heritage policy in Flanders. For over more than 10 years, we have a unified cultural heritage sector in Flanders. There is no longer separate legislation for museums, for archives, for organizations, for popular culture, and so on. Since 2008, all these different kinds of organizations fall under the cultural heritage decree, and therefore are no longer separate worlds anymore. Thanks to this unified legal approach, building bridges between what used to be different worlds, separate worlds, becomes more easier. They influence each other. It also brings tensions with it, because a museum is not an archive and vice versa. But at the end of the day, we all work around heritage, and that is the main thing that connects us. Since the ratification of 2003 UNESCO Convention on Safeguarding Intangible Heritage in 2006, Flanders develops a policy on intangible heritage. And as one of many results, as Shana already mentioned, the latest Cultural Heritage Decree of 2017 enabled an integrated approach to cultural heritage, with explicit attention for intangible heritage within collection managing organizations such as museums. And in Flanders, museums are very dependent on the government when it comes to funding. If they want to receive funding from Flanders, they have to subscribe to the policy that Flanders prescribes. In other words, since the Decree of 17, museums, but also archives, are encouraged to reflect upon intangible heritage and what it can mean for them. Since the new decree, we also have an organization that explicitly focuses on intangible heritage. Of course, I'm talking about the workshop Intangible Heritage, and the birth of this organization also demonstrates the increased attention to intangible heritage on a policy level. So that was very brief on policy. Of course, we have also the heritage practice. And every day the workshop works on the safeguarding of intangible heritage. Very often they do so in closely collaboration with cultural heritage organizations, such as was the case for this project and the previous one, the ICH and Museum project. Beside the workshops, there are quite a few organizations that explicitly develop a policy on and a practice around the safeguarding of intangible heritage. And some of them did so long before the decree of 2017. So we see an increased intention on the practice on safeguarding intangible heritage. It's really important within our sector. So it's safe to say that policy and practice are communicating vessels. The policy influences the heritage practice, but the practice also influences the policy. Next to policy and practice, we see another important factor that explains why there is an increased attention for intangible heritage in museums, and that is how our sector is organized, which is crucial in these matters. Our sector is small, but very networked. Museums have to organize themselves into a network, as have archives, intangible heritage actors, and so on. But, and this is very important, I cannot stress this enough, but these networks don't exist in isolation from each other. They influence each other, they get familiar with each other. In other words, collaboration and cross-fertilization are very much key in our sector. And this is how what used to be different worlds get even more connected. So all of these factors, policy, practice, cross-fertilization between the two, and the way our sector is organized, all these factors contribute to reflections on what a museum is, what it should be, and how it works. And these factors ensure that museums get familiar with intangible heritage and that they can develop, where possible and where desired, a policy and actions on intangible heritage. And thanks to project like this, which act as a catalyst in the sector, we are one step closer to really connecting museums and intangible heritage. We are one step closer to a fully integrated cultural heritage approach and practice. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Evelien. It's good to hear about a step closer to the fully integrated cultural heritage practice. Of course, we all would love to see that happen. And you're right that this project has been a leap forward. Thank you for your analysis. Also from the policy part, I think that's an eye-opener for many or some people who aren't that familiar yet with policy in Flanders. So thank you very much. And thank you for collaborating and partnering with us in all those projects. I have to announce our last, not the last speaker. The next speaker, we have two more closing analysis waiting for you. Next on is Sergio Servellón. Sergio is director of ICOM Belgium-Flanders, the International Council of Museums. That is, I think everybody is familiar with it. But he's also director of the Felix Art Museum in Drogenbos, where you shared some experiences before today with your head as a director of the museum. But I think you will reflect from both perspectives on this project. Please, Sergio, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to congratulate all participants and the organizers of the ACH included in museums project. I think it was a long-term involvement for the museums that took part, and the workshop Intangible Heritage Belgium really took the challenge serious and was able to create a forum for exchange. If 10 years ago you would have told me this was possible in such a collaborating fashion, I would not have believed it. I have to admit this. This process is surviving a bit the ideological start of ICH, and it is at the same time also surpassing the maybe a bit more recalcitrant cynics of the old school. And that is a triumph, because the stars were not really aligned at the beginning. So if we talk about ICH in museums in Flanders, well, we did start in conflict, but we did mature through the coordination. And if what I will tell you at first will sound less ecumenic as Aline's presentation of the cultural field, please bear with me and just listen to the end. As ICOM Belgium-Flanders, of course, I represent here the museum point of view and not the policy caretaker's one. So just as with the museum definition debate in ICOM, we learned that lobbying against each other is not a way. We need to convince, and we have to evolve together as a group. Maybe some of us have like a righteous side and want to shock a revolution. But if history has taught us anything, it is that sustainable change can only come with regrouping after the fight. So we can see this very clearly now on the second try we are doing towards a new proposition of an ICOM definition. The same professionals who voted in great majority, above 70%, not to vote for the presented definition in September 2019, were and are not against the values that were put in that proposal. What they questioned was the methodology or the lack of methodology and the process that was far from democratic, no matter how good the intentions were. So it turns out to be a question of creating a truly participatory debate where you have to take into account different logics and interests of conflict, where prudence, hesitation, and hasty opinions have to work together. And this is where this trajectory of this project shows its value, because it was a concrete path towards a solution of integrating ICH into museum practice. History in Flanders shows that lobbying can impose a top-down sensibilization. Museums were actually, with this new decree, politically imposed to broaden the ICOM functions with ICH nomenclatura. And let's be clear, the new cultural heritage decree was not implemented in collaboration with the museum sector. Now, we can continue to address this in a power play rhetoric, or we can see how we can go forward. And obviously we choose for the last one. ICOM Belgium-Flanders being here could be seen as a way to justify imposing rules, but that's not how we see it. The reality is that, as with the discussions of the museum definition, the values and chances behind these changes can be a way to enrich practices of the museums as a whole, not by increasing the visitor numbers in museums, which is what I suspect that was one of the arguments that ICH lobbyists used to get their message through politicians, but because participation through interaction with all kinds of minorities or grassroots heritage communities does not represent more visitors for museums. So that is not a gain. But what we need to translate is how we professionally can assess ICH within our known practice. This means that awareness for ICH, awareness in general, is a philosophy that should turn technical in order to be practical. Collaboration calls for an attitude change at the same time while respecting the old museum work. Intangible cultural heritage is indeed a bridge between traditional and contemporary cultural values. It not only promotes participation as a method, it defends also the diversity and inclusion as such. And with this, it makes museums part of the changing actors, hopefully, for a more just and sustainable world. Now, museums have already identification, documentation, and inventory of old and new cultural practices already present in the museums. The question now is how the mindset can be more move towards participation and how the heritage communities can be involved. And the project ICH Included in Museum implements this philosophy by getting professionals from different corners to work together. They exchanged ideas and expertise. We did see it today, entering in dialogue together about new models for the future. I personally believe that the research question that the living labs of the learning network made, van Busleyden, Jenevermuseum, Huis van Alijn Museum M, really coined their own research questions. They form a nice matrix for the development of an own ontology regarding ICH and museums. The project is an important, further, more concrete step in the merging of the worlds of intangible heritage and museum. But it has to be also a technical challenge there. And a good example for the need of practical experiment is the digital registration case that Meemoo presented also today. The results of this exercise are 14 user cases in Flanders, which broaden really the view. Actually, at this moment, very moment, there is a meeting session in Ghent on the Flemish government strategy for digital cultural heritage. And I am pretty sure that ICH is not even a topic talk. So we should address this. And I think that together we can make this difference on policy level. So that's what's great about this project. Common ground and shared interests are sought. This way, we are working on the basis of shared concepts, which everyone involved understood and prepared together and benefited in practical exercises. And the projects can serve as an inspiration for whole Flanders, that is for sure. But these are also representing challenges. And from the report, the Flemish administration returned to the workshop Intangible Heritage Belgium when this project was accredited with subsidies. It did say what role Icon Flanders Belgium will play is not clear from the dossier. Nevertheless, this network organization could play an important role in the implementation and sustainability of the result. And so, yes, of course, we are already working on this. We even have Kia from the workshop Intangible Heritage integrated as a board member in Icon Belgium-Flanders, what means that we keep an ICH eye on all our sectoral projects. So did Shana participate in our analysis of the Icon definition survey, and it is really so valuable to create a mandated response also from the ICH professionals. But more practically, we definitely reach out to continuing bridging museums and ICH. Some of the challenges we have to tackle, and for this I will take some remarks I already made at some previous international ICH Congress are, first, an international consensus on registration. I believe in ICH the term is identification, should be made together with its own thesaurus and own methodology, and it is really needed. And I know this is a tedious, a long process, but it is a building block in integrating ICH in museums. The insights from the practical journey that Bert Lemmens told and the inspirational analogical examples from Pip Laurenson could be very nice starting points for a string of symposiums that could be internationally made. That's the first point. The second point would be, let's co-create ethical guidelines and professional conventions that broaden the pure object-oriented focus to an ICH one. Debates about neutrality of museums or political involvement should be addressed from a professional reflex. This could be implemented later on then in an ethical code of ICOM, or be put up front in the workgroup of ETCOM alongside the accessioning standards, the independence of museums, and other upcoming guidelines. Another point I would like to point out is a more in-depth trajectory could be made with the big fine arts museums to really have a reference and best practice on how they could integrate the new ICH world, because this remains a big question. And the last point, more fundamentally, is the question on how museums can go beyond this interpreting stand to participate in the social processes dealing with heritage. This, according to me, can only be tackled after the building steps of this technical to practical side has been taken. So we look forward to the procedures of the Dynamic Knowledge Hub Shana just presented. ICON Belgium-Flanders wants to contribute in anything that could help this evolution forward. In short, we've come a long way in Flanders. After seeing the journey and the results of this project, I promise you this will be the last time I raise up the former problems. From now on, we all have to focus on all the building blocks that are there to be worked with. And I would like to bridge the object and the intangible through the motto of one of the main Belgian historical avant-garde critics and artists, Michel Sefor, who coined the nice oxymoron, "The ephemeral is eternal." I thank you for all your work.
Thank you, Sergio, for those beautiful last words. Thank you so much for raising those questions. I think they should be raised again, but it's great to see how also ICOM and you acknowledge the fact that this was a step forward. And we also are very grateful to hear that ICOM will keep an ICH eye open into this fully integrated view. Also the way this project might be a road or like a signpost on the road towards making museums more inclusive and participatory oriented. We keep that in mind, but also the subjects that are more spiky or something. But thanks for raising them. We will. There's lots more to be discussed about it, and it's a great way to keep on reflecting. Thank you so much. Now let me introduce our last speaker, last but not least, a partner in crime for so long, Sophie Elpers, who is the scientific collaborator, with the Keen Institute, the institute in the Netherlands focusing on intangible heritage. Sophie studied ethnology and art history at many universities, obtained even a PhD at a university in Amsterdam. But she has been affiliated for some time with a Netherlands Center for Intangible Heritage, the Keen, which I refer to, where she's researching the relationship between intangible heritage and tangible heritage. She was also part of the steering committee of the IMP project we discussed earlier, and we love to hear her view on this project. Please, Sophie.
Thank you, Jana. Well, it's really my great pleasure to give some closing and also summarizing remarks on this great conference. The project ICH Included in Museums started when we met in Tilburg in the Netherlands on 11 October 2019 for a first kickoff conference, which was entitled Collecting Intangible Cultural Heritage. And we then knew from, amongst others, our experiences in the Intangible Cultural Heritage and Museums Project, IMP, which was run from 2017 until February 2020, that a more sustainable relationship, more sustainable collaborations of museums and intangible cultural heritage, and a more substantial position of intangible cultural heritage in museums are needed. And we were stimulated by the declaration of the Intangible Cultural Heritage and Museums Project that states, we won't map out the road, but we have pointed out some interesting directions that deserve to be further developed and explored. And we are ready to continue on this journey with you. So I think we're all stimulated by those declarations, and I hope others were also. When we met in Tilburg, we already asked, would and could an integration of intangible cultural heritage in the collection planning and management of museums make the relation between museums and ICH more sustainable? The main conclusions 2 years back were that there are a lot of opportunities for museums and intangible cultural heritage, but we had a lot of questions. What's precisely in it for both? Do we understand the same when we speak about intangible cultural heritage? Do we understand the same when we speak about collecting and collections? How can we come to a shared understanding? How can we develop a common strategy? Which skills does the museum professional need when working with intangible cultural heritage and collecting intangible cultural heritage? And how can one gain those skills? How can we think in new ways? And how can we break the idea that we are limited? And how can we bring together or bridge the different logics of heritage care? Well, 2 years later, I think we are really many steps further. And in the name of the Dutch Center for Intangible Cultural Heritage, I would really like to congratulate Workshop Intangible Heritage and all participating museums for this great project and the great conference. It is really a success that you managed to establish under COVID circumstances a network of 25 museums with 4 very interesting living lab museums in this learning network, and that this learning network will continue sharing experiences, going on with reality checks. I think that's really important to have those checks and to keep on learning, supported by the Dynamic Knowledge Hub you presented, Shana. Thanks a lot. I saw today two topics which I would like to talk about shortly. And that is, the one point is the diversity of museums, and the other is the diversity in museums. I think each lab museum has really different approaches, which already became clear when we heard about the motivations, and also when we heard about the diverse insights. And about the motivation, one of them was, of course, understanding intangible cultural heritage and also finding a shared definition. But then there were many other questions: how to integrate intangible cultural heritage in collection policy, how to help to transmit the knowledge as a part of safeguarding the knowledge heritage communities have. How to collaborate, of course, with intangible cultural heritage communities. Who is the community, and is the museum part of the community? Then how to build up sustainable relations with intangible cultural heritage communities. Which different partners have to be at the table when we discuss about intangible cultural heritage and when we develop a collection policy. Then there was interest in participation. What is the role of intangible cultural heritage in an art museum like Museum M? And how to make also a difference between living and past practices, or maybe not make it different, but referring to what else Veraverbeke said, how to link those both the past and the living practices. And then there were, of course, also quite different insights, or let's say different different insights were had different importance for the different museums. One which I found interesting was the insight that intangible cultural heritage concerns knowledge and skills, and that museums can really make use of those knowledges, also concerning the object knowledge. So the knowledge of communities, how to handle objects, how to handle objects between museum object and an object of use in the intangible cultural heritage practice. And I think also Pip Laurenson elaborated on this in her paper. Then, of course, the insight that one has to activate specific groups when one works with intangible cultural heritage, that documentation of ICH can be realized through the collection, through the objects, that a collection policy is always or should always be a collaborative project of different actors in which the heritage communities play an important role and in which responsibilities are shared. Also that one can use the knowledge of intermediaries or other partners, also the knowledge of heritage cells in Flanders, for instance, and of course the insights about the digital techniques Bert shared with us. So quite different motivation or diverse motivations, quite diverse interests, but the diversity of approaches and possibilities might be sometimes a challenge, and every museum has to make its own choices depending on what the museum is about, but it is also a great opportunity, and I think we have seen this. I'm very convinced that we all can learn from each other, and the paper by Pip has also shown this quite intriguingly. Then the diversity of within the museums. I think this is also a very important topic, and even if we did not really talked about it directly, I felt we talked about it in an indirect way, and I think the whole project has an important inspiring inspiring role in that, and I will explain shortly. Well, what is happening between museums and intangible cultural heritage is quite complex. It's really not easy, and we have to be aware of this complexity. A multi-layered web of diverse actors is involved in the interplay of intangible cultural heritage and museums. And Evelien has also referred to that network some minutes ago. It concerns actors with diverse interests, different sorts of knowledge, different skills, and different infrastructures in which they act. Heritage practitioners, museum workers, but also workers employees from intangible cultural heritage organizations like Workshop Intangible Heritage, or like the Dutch Center for Intangible Cultural Heritage, with different professional backgrounds if you compare those with the museum workers. Then, of course, diverse local as well as global policy makers. The general public with its own multiple expectations. And I would have loved to talk more about this public, but I'm sure we can do next time. The roles can overlap, for instance, when museums are part of the heritage community, as was also the question in the Jenevermuseum. But furthermore, the power relations in the web might be imbalanced, conflicting, asymmetrical due to political, social, cultural, economic, and other dynamics. Also, it was said today, who are we that we can make decisions about intangible cultural heritage as museums? So this is, I think, a good moment of reflection. And at the same time, heritage is always determined by multiple perspectives. Different people have different, diverse, and not seldom conflicting ideas and emotions about a certain element of heritage. Think about the Geneva heritage that has to do with alcohol. But there are, of course, other heritages that are even more connected to conflicting ideas. And I think it is striking that one often speaks in general terms about the museum in this context, as if museums were acting beings. the precise role of the individual employees, their individual emotional commitments and considerations, then diverse networks and alliances often remain underexposed, and work processes within museums remain intransparent or unreflected. And reflection is needed that focuses on those individual actors with their own knowledge and emotions about intangible cultural heritage items they might deal with in the museum. And of course, in this huge system of heritage politics and its infrastructures and reference frameworks, in this space where intangible heritage and museums meet. And I think the project Intangible Cultural Heritage Included in Museums had made step into that direction of reflection, because it stimulated reflection in a friendly and in an inspiring way, departing from the question how to work with intangible cultural heritage in collection plans, but also from the question, aren't we ourselves part of intangible cultural heritage communities? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sophie, for raising even more questions. But that's a great way to go into the weekend, and we have to continue this dialogue. I'm sure we will be, or it's not a dialogue, it's like a group talk. But I love the way how you concluded with how also we can be part of how we are part of these communities. So many more questions you raised. I cannot recap them all, but we recorded everything, and we are so happy with this fertile ground for discussion. Thank you so much also for partnering, for believing in these projects that made a difference. We are past 5, so I have to give the last word to Shana, who is better suited to wish us all a good weekend and a thanks and a goodbye. Shana, please go ahead.
Well, Jana, you've said it all. Thank you so much for joining us at the end of this project, but the start of a greater learning network, hopefully even more living lab museums. Thank you for your questions, for your reflections, for your interaction with us and with the partner museums. Again, thank you to all our partners and all museums involved for making this project such a great success. And to continue working with us together in the future to enrich the cultural heritage field in Flanders and beyond. So thank you and have a nice weekend, everyone. Don't forget to subscribe to the newsletter if you want to get an update about when the report is uploaded. Of course, the conference itself will also be uploaded and also have a report. Thank you again and have a nice weekend.
Thank you, Shana.
Bye.
Thank you, Shana.
Bye. Good weekend to all.
Bye.
There's so many more beautiful messages in the chat.
I can't read them all. I think we were going to stop recording now. Bye-bye.